Chapter 17. The doctor's office. Stripped to his underpants, lying on the examination table, Danny Torrance looked very small. He was looking up at Dr. Just Call Me Bill Edmonds, who was wheeling a large black machine up beside him. Danny rolled his eyes to get a better look at it.
"Don't let it scare you, guy,"
Bill Edmonds said.
"It's an electroencephalograph, and it doesn't hurt."
Electro?
We call it EEG for short. I'm going to hook a bunch of wires to your head. No, not stick them in, only tape them. And the pins in this part of the gadget will record your brain waves.
Like on the $6 Million Man?
About the same. Would you like to be like Steve Austin when you grow up?
No way, Danny said as the nurse began to tape the wires to a number of tiny shaved spots on his scalp. My daddy says that someday he'll get a short circuit and then he'll be up the creek.
I know that creek well,
Dr. Edmonds said amiably.
I've been up it a few times myself. Sans paddle. And EEG can tell us lots of things, Danny.
Like what?
Like, for instance, if you have epilepsy. That's a little problem where...
Yeah, I know what epilepsy is.
Really?
Sure. There was a kid in my nursery school back in Vermont. I went to nursery school when I was a little kid, and he had it. He wasn't supposed to use the flashboard.
What was that, Dan?
He had turned on the machine. Thin lines began to trace their way across graph paper. It had all these lights, all different colors, and when you turned it on, some colors would flash, but not all of them. And you had to count the colors, and if you pushed the right button, you could turn it off. Well, Brent couldn't use that.
That's because bright flashing lights sometimes cause an epileptic seizure.
You mean using the flashboard might have made Brent pitch a fit? Edmonds and the nurse exchanged a brief, amused glance.
Inelegantly but accurately put, Danny.
What?
I said you're right, except you shouldn't say seizure instead of pitch a fit. That's not nice. Okay, lie just as still as a mouse now.
Okay.
Danny, when you have these, whatever they are, do you ever recall seeing bright flashing lights before?
No.
Funny noises, ringing, or chimes like a doorbell? How about a funny smell? Maybe like oranges or sawdust, or a smell like something rotten.
No, sir.
Sometimes do you feel like crying before you pass out? Even though you don't feel sad?
No way.
That's fine then.
Have I got epilepsy, Dr. Bill?
I don't think so, Danny. Just lie still. Almost done.
The machine hummed and scratched for another 5 minutes, and then Dr. Edmonds shut it off.
All done, Guy,
Edmonds said briskly.
Let Sally get those electrodes off you and then come into the next room. I want to have a little talk with you, okay?
Sure.
Sally, you go ahead and give him a time test before he comes in.
All right. Edmonds ripped off the long curl of paper the machine had extruded and went into the next room, looking at it.
I'm going to...
Excuse me.
I'm going to prick your arm just a little,
the nurse said after Danny had pulled up his pants.
Is to make sure you don't have TB.
Oh, they gave me that at my school just last year, Danny said without much hope.
Well, but that was a long time ago, and you're a big boy now, right?
I guess so. Danny sighed and offered his arm up for sacrifice. When he had his shirt and shoes on, he went through the sliding door and into Dr. Edmonds' office. Edmonds was sitting on the edge of his desk, swinging his legs thoughtfully.
Hi, Danny.
Hi.
How's that hand now?
He pointed at Danny's left hand, which was slightly bandaged.
Pretty good.
Good. I looked at your EEG and it seems fine. But I'm going to send it to a friend of mine in Denver who makes his living reading those things. I just want to make sure.
Yes, sir.
Tell me all about Tony, Dan.
Danny shuffled his feet. He's just an invisible friend, he said. I made him up to keep me company. Edmonds laughed and put his hands on Danny's shoulders.
Now that's what your mom and dad say. But this is just between us, Guy. I'm your doctor. Tell me the truth and I'll promise not to tell them unless you say I can.
Danny thought about it. He looked at Edmonds, and then with a small effort of concentration, he tried to catch Edmonds' thoughts, or at least the color of his mood. And suddenly he got an oddly comforting image in his head. File cabinets, their doors sliding shut one after another, locking with a click. Written on the small tabs in the center of each door was A to C, secret, D to G, secret, and so on. This made Danny feel a little easier. Cautiously, he said, I don't know who Tony is.
Is he your age?
No, he's at least 11. I think he might be even older. I've never seen him right up close. He might be old enough to drive a car.
You just see him at a distance, huh?
Yes, sir.
And he always comes just before you pass out.
Well, I don't pass out. It's like I go with him, and he shows me things.
What kind of things?
Well, Danny debated for a moment, and then told Edmonds about Daddy's trunk, with all his writing in it, and about how the movers hadn't lost it between Vermont and Colorado after all. It had been right under the stairs all along.
And your daddy found it where Tony said he would.
Oh, yes, sir. Only Tony didn't tell me. He showed me.
I understand. Danny, what did Tony show you last night? When you locked yourself in the bathroom.
I don't remember, Danny said quickly.
Are you sure?
Yes, sir.
A moment ago, I said you locked the bathroom door, but that wasn't right, was it? Tony locked the door.
No, sir. Tony couldn't lock the door because he isn't real. He wanted me to do it, so I did. I locked it.
Does Tony always show you where the lost things are?
No, sir. Sometimes he shows me things that are gonna happen.
Really?
Sure. Like one time Tony showed me the amusements in Wild Animal Park in Great Barrington. Tony said I'm Danny. Tony said Daddy was gonna take me there for my birthday. He did too.
What else does he show you?
Danny frowned. Signs. He's always showing me stupid old signs, and I can't read them, hardly ever.
Why do you suppose Tony would do that, Danny?
I don't know, Danny brightened. But my daddy and mommy are teaching me to read, and I'm trying real hard.
So you can read Tony's signs?
Well, I really want to learn. But that too, yeah.
Do you like Tony, Danny?
Danny looked at the tile floor and said nothing.
Danny!
It's hard to tell, Danny said. I used to hope he'd come every day because he always showed me the good things, especially since Mommy and Daddy don't think about divorce anymore. Dr. Edmonds' gaze sharpened, but Danny didn't notice. He was looking hard at the floor, concentrating on expressing himself. But now whenever he comes, he shows me bad things. Awful things. Like in the bathroom last night. The things he shows me, they sting me like those wasps stung me. Only Tony's things sting me up here. He cocked a finger gravely at his temple, a small boy unconsciously burlesquing suicide.
What things, Danny?
I can't remember, Danny cried out, agonized. I'd tell you if I could. It's like I can't remember because it's so bad I don't want to remember. All I can remember when I wake up is red rum!
Red drum? Or red rum?
Rum!
What's that, Danny?
I don't know.
Danny?
Yes, sir?
Can you make Tony come now?
I don't know. He doesn't always come. I don't even know if I want him to come anymore.
Try, Danny. I'll be right here.
Danny looked at Edmonds doubtfully. Edmonds nodded encouragement. Danny let out a long, sighing breath, but not as loud and sighing as every breath that the doctor made, and nodded. But I don't know if it'll work. I never did it with anyone looking at me before, and Tony doesn't always come anyway.
If he doesn't, he doesn't, Edmonds said. I just want you to try.
Okay. He dropped his gaze to Edmonds' slowly swinging loafers and cast his mind outward toward his mommy and daddy. They were there someplace, right beyond that wall with a picture on it, as a matter of fact, in the waiting room where they had come in, sitting side by side but not talking, leafing through magazines, worried about him. He concentrated harder, his brow furrowing, trying to get into the feeling of his mommy's thoughts. It was always harder when they weren't right there in the room with him. Then he began to get it. Mommy was thinking about a sister. Her sister. The sister was dead. His mommy was thinking that was the main thing that turned her mommy into such a bitch, into such an old biddy, because her sister had died. As a little girl, she was hit by a car. Oh God, I can never stand anything like that again, like Eileen, but what if he's sick, really sick, cancer, spinal meningitis, leukemia, brain tumor, like John Gunther's son, or muscular dystrophy. Oh geez, kids this age get leukemia all the time. Radium treatments, chemotherapy, we couldn't afford anything like that, but of course they just can't turn you out and to die on the street, can they? And anyway, he's all right. You really shouldn't let yourself think, Danny, about Eileen and Danny. That car, Danny. But Tony wasn't there, only his voice. And as it faded, Danny followed it down into darkness, falling and tumbling down some magic hole between Dr. Bill's swinging loafers, past a loud knocking sound. Further, a bathtub cruised silently by, in the darkness with some horrible thing lolling in it, past a sound like sweetly chiming church bells, past a clock under a dome of glass. Then the dark was pierced feebly by a single light festooned with cobwebs. The weak glow disclosed a stone floor that looked damp and unpleasant. Somewhere not far distant was a steady mechanical roaring sound, but muted, not frightening, soporific. It was the thing that would be forgotten, Danny thought with dreamy surprise. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he could see Tony just ahead of him, a silhouette. Tony was looking at something, and Danny strained his eyes to see what it was.
Your daddy. See your daddy.
Of course he did. How could he have missed him? Even in the basement's light's feeble glow, Daddy was kneeling on the floor, casting the beam of flashlight over old cardboard boxes and wooden crates. The cardboard boxes were mushy and old. Some of them had split open and spilled drifts of paper onto the floor. Newspapers, books, printed pieces of paper that looked like bills. His daddy was examining them with great interest. And then Daddy looked up and shone his flashlight in another direction. Its beam of light impaled another book. A large white one, bound with gold string. The cover looked like white leather. It was a scrapbook. Danny suddenly needed to cry out to his daddy to tell him to leave that book alone. That some books should not be opened. But his daddy was climbing toward it. The mechanical roaring sound, which he now recognized as the boiler at the Overlook, which Daddy checked 3 or 4 times every day, had developed an ominous rhythmic hitching. It began to sound like pounding. And the smell of mildew and wet, rotting paper was changing into something else. The high junipery smell of the bad stuff. It hung around his daddy like a vapor as he reached for the book and grasped it. Tony was somewhere in the darkness.
This inhuman place makes human monsters. This inhuman place,
repeating the same incomprehensible thing over and over,
makes human monsters.
Falling through darkness again, now accompanied by the heavy pounding thunder that was no longer the boiler but the sound of a whistling mallet striking silk-papered walls, knocking out whiffs of plaster dust, crouching helplessly on the blue-black woven jungle rug.
Come out, this inhuman place, and take your medicine. Makes inhuman monsters.
With a gasp that echoed in his own head, he jerked himself out of the darkness. Hands were on him, and at first he shrank back, thinking that the dark thing in the overlook of Tony's world had somehow followed him back into the world of the real things. And then Dr. Edmonds was saying,
You're all right, Danny. You're all right. Everything is fine.
Danny recognized the doctor, then his surroundings in the office. He began to shudder helplessly. Edmonds held him. When the reaction began to subside, Edmonds asked,
You said something about monsters, Danny. What was it?
This inhuman place, he said gutturally. Tony told me. This inhuman place makes... He shook his head. Can't remember.
Try.
I can't.
Did Tony come?
Yes.
What did he show you?
Dark pounding. I don't remember.
Where were you?
Leave me alone! I don't remember! Leave me alone! He began to sob helplessly in fear and frustration. It was all gone, dissolved into a sticky mess like a wet bundle of paper, the memory unreadable. Edmonds went to the water cooler and got him a paper cup of water. Danny drank it and Edmonds got him another one.
Better?
Yes.
Danny, I don't want to badger you, tease you about this, but can you remember anything about before Tony came?
My mommy? Danny said slowly. She's worried about me.
Mothers always are, Guy.
No. She had a sister that died when she was a little girl. Eileen? She was thinking about how Eileen got hit by a car and that made her worried about me. I don't remember anything else. Edmonds was looking at him sharply.
Just now she was thinking that. Out in the waiting room.
Yes, sir.
Danny, how would you know that?
I don't know, Danny said wanly. The Shining, I guess?
The what?
Danny shook his head very slowly. I'm awful tired. Can I go see Mommy and Daddy? I don't want to answer any more questions. I'm tired, and you're weird, and my stomach hurts.
Are you gonna throw up?
No, sir. I just want to go see my Mommy and Daddy. You're freaking me out.
Okay, Dan.
Edmund stood up.
You go on out and see them for a minute, then see them in so I can talk to them, okay?
Yes, sir.
There are books out there to look at. You like books, don't you?
Yes, sir, Danny said dutifully.
You're a good boy, Danny.
Danny gave him a faint smile.
I can't find a thing wrong with him,
Dr. Edmonds said to the Torrances.
Not physically. Mentally he's bright and rather too imaginative. It happens. Children have to grow into their imaginations like a pair of oversized shoes. Danny's still way too big for him. Ever had his IQ tested?
I don't believe in those, Jack said. They straitjacket the expectations of both parents and teachers. Dr. Edmonds nodded.
That may be. But if you did test him, I think you'd find he's right off the scale for his age group. His verbal ability for a boy who is 5 going on 6 is amazing.
We don't talk down to him, Jack said with a trace of pride.
I doubt if you've ever had to in order to make yourself understood.
Edmonds paused, fiddling with a pen.
He went into a trance while I was with him, by the way, at my request. Exactly as you described him in the bathroom last night. All his muscles went lax, his body slumped, his eyeballs rotated outward. Textbook auto-hypnosis. I was amazed. I still am.
The Torrances sat forward. What happened? Wendy asked tensely, and Edmonds carefully related Danny's trance, the muttered phrase from which Edmonds had only been able to pluck the word monsters, the dark, and pounding, the aftermath of tears, near hysteria, and nervous stomach. Tony again, Jack said. What does it mean? Wendy asked. Have you any idea?
A few. You might not like them.
Well, go ahead anyway, Jack told him.
From what Danny told me, his invisible friend was truly a friend until you folks moved out here from New England. Tony has only become a threatening figure since that move. The pleasant interludes have become nightmarish, even more frightening to your son because he can't remember exactly what the nightmares are about. That's common enough. We all remember our pleasant dreams more clearly than the scary ones. There seems to be a buffer somewhere between the conscious and the subconscious, and one hell of a blue nose lives in there. This sensor only lets through a small amount, and often what does come through is only symbolic. That's oversimplified Freud. but it does pretty much describe what we know of the mind's interaction with itself.
You think moving this has upset Danny that badly? Wendy asked.
It may have, if the move took place under traumatic circumstances.
Shit, I lost my page. Edmund said.
Did it?
Wendy and Jack exchanged a glance. I was teaching at a prep school, Jack said slowly. I lost my job.
I see,
Edmund said. He put the pen he had been playing with firmly back in his holder.
There's more here, I'm afraid. It may be painful to you. Your son seems to believe you two have seriously contemplated divorce. He spoke of it in an offhand way, but only because he believes you're no longer considering it.
Jack's mouth dropped open, and Wendy recoiled as if slapped. The blood drained from her face. We never even discussed it, she said. Not in front of him. Not even in front of each other. I think it's best if you understand everything, Doctor. You seem like a reasonable guy, after all, Jack said. Shortly after Danny was born, I became an alcoholic. I had a drinking problem all the way through college. It subsided a little after Wendy and I met. Cropped up worse than ever after Danny was born, and the writing I considered to be my real work was going badly. When Danny was 3.5, he spilled some beer on a bunch of papers I was working on. Papers I was shuffling around anyway, and, well, shit. His voice broke, and his eyes remained dry and unflinching. It sounds so goddamn beastly said out aloud. I broke his arm, turning him around to spank him. 3 months later, I gave up drinking. I haven't touched it since.
I see, Edmund said neutrally. I knew the arm had been broken, of course. It was set well. He pushed back from his desk a little and crossed his legs. If I may be frank, it's obvious that he's been in no way abused since then. Other than the stings, there's nothing on him but the normal bruises and scabs that any kid has in abundance.
Of course not, Wendy said hotly. Jack didn't mean... No, Wendy, Jack said. I meant to do it. I guess someplace inside I really did mean to do that to him. Or something even worse. He looked back at Edmonds again. You know something, Doctor? This is the first time the word divorce has been mentioned between us. And alcoholism. And, child beating. 3 firsts in 5 minutes.
Well, that may be at the root of the problem. I am not a psychiatrist. If you want Danny to see a child psychiatrist, I can recommend a good one that works out of the Mission Ridge Medical Center in Boulder. But I'm fairly confident of my diagnosis. Danny is an intelligent, imaginative, perceptive boy. I don't believe he would have been as upset by your marital problems as you believed. Small children are great acceptors. They don't understand shame or the need to hide things.
Jack was studying his hands. Wendy took one of them and squeezed it. I don't know who's talking. I'm guessing this is the doctor. But he sensed the things that were wrong. Chief among them, from his point of view, was not the broken arm, but the broken or breaking link between you two. He mentioned divorce to me, but not the broken arm.
When my nurse mentioned the set to him, he simply shrugged it off. It was no pressure thing. It happened a long time ago, is what I think he said.
That kid, Jack muttered. His jaws were clamped together, the muscles in the cheeks standing out. We don't deserve him.
You have him all the same, Edmund said dryly. At any rate, he retires into a fantasy world from time to time. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of kids do. As I recall, I had my own invisible friend when I was Danny's age. A talking rooster named Chug Chug. Of course, no one could see Chug Chug but me. I had 2 older brothers who often left me behind, and in such a situation, Chug Chug came in mighty handy. And of course, you two must understand why Danny's invisible friend is named Tony instead of Mike or Hal or Dutch.
Yes, Wendy said.
Have you ever pointed it out to him?
No, Jack said. Should we?
Why bother? Let him realize it in his own time, by his own logic. You see, Danny's fantasies were considerably deeper than those that grow around the ordinary invisible friend syndrome, but he felt he needed Tony that much more. I love to breathe. Tony would come and show him pleasant things. Sometimes amazing things. Always good things. Once Tony showed him where Daddy's lost trunk was, under the stairs. Another time, Tony showed him when Mommy and Daddy were going to take him to an amusement park for his birthday.
At Great Barrington, Wendy cried. But how could he know those things? Oh, it's eerie. The things that he comes out with sometimes, almost as if...
He had second sight,
Edmonds asked, smiling. He was born with a caul, Wendy said weakly. Edmonds' smile became a good, hearty laugh. Jack and Wendy exchanged a glance, and they also smiled, both of them amazed at how easy it was. Danny's occasional lucky guesses about things was something else they had not discussed much.
Next you'll be telling me he can levitate. No, I'm afraid not. It's not extrasensory, but good old human perception, which in Danny's case is unusually keen. Mr. Torrance, I love how smart I am. He knew your trunk was under the stairs because you had looked everywhere else. Process of elimination, what? It's so simple, Ellery Queen would laugh at it. Sooner or later, you would have thought of it yourself. As for the amusement park at Great Barrington, oh my God, I'm just whipping these things out left and right. Whose idea was that originally? Yours or his?
His, of course, Wendy said. They advertised on all the morning children's programs. He was wild to go, but the thing is, Doctor, we couldn't afford to take him, and we had told him so. Well, then a men's magazine I'd sold a story to back in 1971 sent a check for $50. They were reprinting the story in an annual or something, so we decided to spend it on Danny. Edmonds shrugged.
Wish fulfillment plus a lucky coincidence.
God damn it, I bet that's just right, Jack said. Edmonds smiled a little.
And Danny himself told me that Tony often showed him things that never occurred. Visions based on faulty perception, that's all. Danny is doing subconsciously what these so-called mystics and mind readers do quite consciously and cynically. I admire him for it. If life doesn't cause him to retract his antennae, I think he'll be quite a man.
Wendy nodded. Of course she thought Danny would be quite a man, but the doctor's explanations struck her as glib. It tasted more like margarine than butter. Edmonds had not lived with them. He had not been there when Danny found lost buttons, told her that maybe the TV guide was under the bed, that he thought he better wear his rubbers to nursery school, even though the sun was out, and later that day they had walked home under her umbrella through the pouring rain. Edmonds couldn't know of the curious way Danny had of pre-guessing them both. She would decide to have an unusual evening cup of tea, go in the kitchen and find her cup out with a tea bag in it. She would remember that the books were due at the library and find them all neatly piled up on the hall table, her library card on top. Or Jack would take it into his head to wax the Volkswagen and find Danny already out there, listening to tinny top 40 music on his crystal radio as he sat on the curb to watch. Aloud, she said, "Then why the nightmares now? Why did Tony tell him to lock the bathroom door?"
I believe it's because Tony has outlived his usefulness. He was born, Tony, not Danny, at a time when you and your husband were straining to keep your marriage together. Your husband was drinking too much. There was the incident of the broken arm, the ominous quiet between you.
Ominous quiet, yes. That phrase was the real thing, anyway. The stiff, tense meals where the only conversation had been, "Please pass the butter," or "Danny, eat the rest of your carrots," or may I be excused, please?" The nights when Jack was gone, and she had lain down, dry-eyed on the couch, while Danny watched TV. The mornings when she and Jack had stalked around each other like two angry cats, with a quivering, frightened mouse between them. It all rang true. Dear God, do old scars ever stop hurting? Horribly, horribly true. Edmonds resumed.
But things have changed. You know schizoid behavior is a pretty common thing in children. It's accepted, because all we adults have this unspoken agreement that childs are lunatics. They have invisible friends. They may go and sit in the closet when they're depressed, withdrawing from the world. They attach talismanic importance to a special blanket, or a teddy bear, or a stuffed tiger. They suck their thumbs. When an adult sees things that aren't there, we consider him ready for the rubber room. When a child says he's seen a troll in his bedroom or a vampire outside the window, we simply smile indulgently. We have a one-sentence explanation that explains a whole range of such phenomena in children.
He'll grow out of it, Jack said. Edmonds blinked.
My very words,
he said.
Yes. Now I would guess that Danny was in a pretty good position to develop a full-fledged psychosis. Unhappy home life, a big imagination, the invisible friend who was so real to him that he nearly became real to you. Instead of growing out of his childhood schizophrenia, he might well have grown into it.
And become autistic? Wendy asked. She had read about autism. The word itself frightened her. It sounded like dread and white silence.
Possible, but not necessarily. He might simply have entered Tony's world someday and never come back to what he calls real things.
God, Jack said.
But now the basic situation has changed drastically. Mr. Torrance no longer drinks. You are in a new place where conditions have forced the three of you into a tighter family unit than ever before. Certainly tighter than my own, where my wife and kids may see me for only 2 or 3 hours a day. To my mind, he is in the perfect healing situation. And I think the very fact that he is able to differentiate so sharply between Tony's world and the real thing says a lot about the fundamentally healthy state of his mind. He says that you two are no longer considering divorce. Is he as right as I think he is?
Yes, Wendy said, and Jack squeezed her hand tightly, almost painfully. She squeezed back. Edmonds nodded.
He really doesn't need Tony anymore. Danny is flushing him out of his system. Tony no longer brings pleasant visions but hostile nightmares that are too frightening for him to remember except fragmentarily. He internalized Tony during a difficult, desperate life situation, and Tony is not leaving easily, but he is leaving. Your son is a little like a junkie kicking the habit.
He stood up, and the Torrances stood also.
As I said, I'm not a psychiatrist. And if the nightmares are still continuing when your job at the Overlook ends next spring, Mr. Torrance, I would strongly urge you to take him to this man in Boulder.
I will.
Well, let's go out and tell him he can go home,
Edmund said. I want to thank you, Jack told him painfully. I feel better about this than I have in a very long time. So do I, Wendy said. At the door, Edmonds paused and looked at Wendy.
Do you or did you have a sister, Mrs. Torrance, named Eileen?
Wendy looked at him surprised. Yes, I did. She was killed outside our home in Somersworth, New Hampshire, when she was 6 and I was 10. She chased a ball into the street and was struck by a delivery van.
Does Danny know that?
I don't know. I don't think so.
He says you were thinking about her in the waiting room.
I was, Wendy said slowly. For the first time in I don't know how long.
Does the word red rum mean anything to either of you?
Wendy shook her head, but Jack said, he mentioned that word last night, just before he went to sleep. Red drum?
No, rum, Edmonds corrected. He was quite emphatic about that. Rum, as in the drink, the alcoholic drink.
Oh, Jack said. Well, it fits in, doesn't it? He took his handkerchief out of his back pocket and wiped his lips with it.
Does the phrase, The Shining, mean anything to you?
This time, they both shook their heads.
It doesn't matter, I guess.
He opened the door into the waiting room.
Anybody here named Danny Torrance that would like to go home?
Hi, Daddy. Hi, Mommy. He stood up from the small table where he had been leafing slowly through a copy of Where the Wild Things Are, and muttering the words he knew aloud. He ran to Jack, who scooped him up. Wendy ruffled his hair. Edmonds peered at him.
If you don't love your mommy and daddy, you can stay with good old Bill.
No, sir, Danny said emphatically. He slung one arm around Jack's neck, one arm around Wendy's, and looked radiantly happy.
Okay,
Edmonds said, smiling. He looked at Wendy.
You call if you have any problems.
Yes.
I don't think you will,
Edmonds said, smiling. Enough of that. No more doctors. Personal opinions on doctors didn't come through too much in that. There's a lot of doctor talk. I apologize. Chapter. Oh. I thought I lost you. I just lost myself. Okay. Chapter 18. The Scrapbook. Jack found the scrapbook on the 1st of November. While his wife and son were hiking up the rutted old road that ran from behind the rope court to a deserted sawmill 2 miles farther up. The fine weather still held, and all three of them had acquired improbable autumn suntans. He had gone down into the basement to knock the press down on the boiler, and then on impulse, he had taken the flashlight from the shelf where the plumbing schematics were and decided to look at some of the old papers. He was also looking for good places to set his traps, although he didn't plan to do that for another month. "I want them all to be home from vacation," he had told Wendy. Shining the flashlight ahead of him, he stepped past the elevator shaft. At Wendy's insistence, they hadn't used the elevator since they moved in. And through the small stone arch, his nose wrinkled at the smell of rotting paper. Behind him, the boiler kicked on with a thundering whoosh, making him jump. He flickered the light around, whistling tunelessly between his teeth. There was a scale model Andes range down here. Dozens of boxes and crates stuffed with papers, most of them white and shapeless, with age and damp. Others had broken open and spilled yellow sheaves of paper onto the stone floor. There were bales of newspaper tied up with hay rope. Some boxes contained what looked like ledgers, and others contained invoices bound with rubber bands. Jack pulled one out and put the flashlight beam on it. Rocky Mountain Express Incorporated, 2 Overlook Hotel. From Sidey's Warehouse, 1210 16th Street, Denver, Colorado, via Canadian Pacific Railroad. Contents: 400 cases Delsey toilet tissue, 1 gross case. Signed DEF. Date August 24th, 1954. Smiling, Jack let the paper drop back into the box. He flashed the light above it, and it speared a hanging light bulb, almost buried in cobwebs. There was no chain pull. He stood on tiptoe and tried screwing the bulb in. It lit weakly. He picked up the toilet paper invoice again and used it to wipe off some of the cobwebs. The glow didn't brighten much. Still using the flashlight, he wandered through the boxes and bales of paper, looking for rat spoor. They had been here, but not for quite a long time, maybe years. He found some droppings that were powdery with age, and several nests of neatly shredded paper that were old and unused. Jack pulled a newspaper from one of the bundles and glanced down at the headline. Johnson promises orderly transition. Says work begun by JFK will go forward in coming year. The paper was the Rocky Mountain News, dated December 19th, 1963. He dropped it back into the pile. He supposed he wasn't fascinated by that commonplace sense of history that anyone can feel glancing through the fresh news of 10 or 20 years ago. He found gaps in the piled newspapers and records. Nothing from 1937 to 45, from 57 to 60, from 62 to 63. Periods when the hotel had been closed, he guessed. When it had been between suckers grabbing for the brass ring. Ullman's explanation for the Overlook's checkered career still didn't ring quite true to him. It seemed that the Overlook's spectacular location alone should have guaranteed its continuing success. There had always been an American jet set, even before jets were invented, and it seemed to Jack that the Overlook should have been one of the bases they touched in their migrations. It even sounded right. The Waldorf in May, the Bar Harbor House in June and July, the Overlook in August and early September, before moving on to Bermuda, Havana, Rio, wherever. He found a pile of old desk registers, and they bore him out. Nelson Rockefeller in 1950, Henry Ford and Family in 1927, Jean Harlow in 1930, Clark Gable and Carol Lombard. In 1956, the whole top floor had been taken for a week by Darrell F. Zanuck and party. The money must have rolled down the corridors and into the cash registers like a 20th century Comstock load. The management must have been spectacularly bad. There was history here, all right. And not just in newspaper headlines. It was buried between the entries in these ledgers and account books and room service chits where you couldn't quite see it. In 1922, Warren G. Harding had ordered a whole salmon at 10 o'clock in the evening and a case of Coors beer. But whom had he been eating and drinking with? Had it been a poker game? A strategy session? What? Jack glanced at his watch and was surprised to see that 45 minutes had somehow slipped by since he had come down here. His hands and arms were grimy, and he probably smelled bad. He decided to go up and take a shower before Wendy and Danny got back. He walked slowly between the mountains of paper, his mind alive and ticking over possibilities in a speedy way that was exhilarating. He hadn't felt this way in years. It suddenly seemed that the book he had semi-jokingly promised himself might really happen. It might even be right here, buried in these untidy heaps of paper. It could be a work of fiction, or history, or both. A long book exploding out of this central place in 100 directions. He stood beneath the cobwebby light, took his handkerchief from his back pocket without thinking, and scrubbed it at his lips with it. And that was when he saw the scrapbook. A pile of 5 boxes stood on his left like some tottering Pisa. The one on top was stuffed with more invoices and ledgers. Balanced on top of those, keeping its angle of repose for who knew how many years, was a thick scrapbook with white leather covers, its pages bound with 2 hanks of gold string that had been tied along the binding in gaudy bows. Curious, he went over and took it down. The top cover was thick with dust. He held it on a plane at lip level, blew the dust off in a cloud, and then opened it. As he did so, a card fluttered out, and he grabbed it in midair before it could fall onto the stone floor. It was rich and creamy, dominated by a raised engraving of the Overlook, with every window alight. The lawn and playground were decorated with glowing Japanese lanterns. It looked almost as though you could step right into it. An Overlook hotel that had existed 30 years ago. Horace M. Derwent requests the pleasure of your company at a masked ball to celebrate the grand opening of the Overlook Hotel. Dinner will be served at 8 p.m. Unmasking and dancing at midnight, August 29th, 1945. RSVP. Dinner at 8. Unmasking at midnight. He could almost see them in the dining room, the richest men in America and their women. Tuxedos and glimmering starched shirts, evening gowns, the band playing, gleaming high-heeled pumps, the clink of glasses, the jocund pop of champagne corks. The war was over, or almost over. The future lay ahead, clean and shining. America was the colossus of the world, and at last she knew it and accepted it. And later, at midnight, Derwent himself crying, Unmask! Unmask! The masks coming off, and the Red Death held sway over all. He frowned. What left field did that come out of? That was Poe, the great American hack. And surely the overlook, this shining, glowing overlook, on the invitation he held in his hands, was the furthest cry from E.A. Poe imaginable. He put the invitation back and turned to the next page. A pay stub from one of the Denver papers, and scratched beneath it the date, May 15th, 1947. Bosch Mountain Resort reopens with stellar guest register. Derwent says Overlook will be showplace of the world. By David Felton, features editor.
The Overlook Hotel has been opened and reopened in its 38-year history, but rarely with such style and dash as that promised by Horace Derwent, the mysterious California millionaire, who is the latest owner of the hostelry. Derwent, who makes no secret of having sunk more than $1 million into the newest venture, and some say the figure is closer to $3 million, says that the new Overlook will be one of the world's showplaces, the kind of hotel you will remember overnighting in 30 years later. When Derwent, who is rumored to have substantial Las Vegas holdings, was asked if his purchase and refurbishing of the Overlook signaled the opening gun in a battle to legalize casino-style gambling in Colorado, the aircraft, movie, munitions, and shipping magnate denied it, with a smile. The Overlook would be cheapened by gambling, he said. And don't think I'm knocking Vegas. They've got too many of my markers out there for me to do that. I have no interest in lobbying for legalized gambling in Colorado. It would be spitting into the wind. When the Overlook opens officially, there was a gigantic and hugely successful party there some time ago when the actual work was finished. The newly painted, papered, and decorated rooms will be occupied by a stellar guest list, ranging from chic designer Corbett Stanny to... Smiling bemusedly, Jack turned the page. Now he was looking at a full-page ad from the New York Sunday Times travel section. On the page after that, a story on Derwent himself. A balding man, with eyes that pierced you even from an old newsprint photo. He was wearing rimless spectacles and a 40s-style pencil-line mustache that did nothing at all to make him look like Errol Flynn. His face was that of an accountant. It was the eyes that made him look like someone or something else. Jack skimmed the article rapidly. He knew most of the information from a Newsweek story on Derwent the year before. Born poor in St. Paul, never finished high school, joined the Navy instead. Rose rapidly, then left in a bitter wrangle over the patent on a new type of propeller that he had designed. In the tug-of-war between the Navy and an unknown man named Horace Derwent, Uncle Sam came off the predictable winner. But Uncle Sam had never gotten another patent, and there had been a lot of them. In the late 20s and early 30s, Derwent turned to aviation. He bought out a bankrupt crop dusting company, turned it into an airmail service, and prospered. More patents followed. A new monoplane wing design, a bomb carriage used on the flying fortresses that had rained fire on Hamburg and Dresden and Berlin, a machine gun that was cooled by alcohol, a prototype of the ejection seat later used in United States jets. And along the line, the accountant who lived in the same skin as the inventor kept piling up the investments. A piddling string of munitions factories in New York and New Jersey, 5 textile mills in New England, chemical factories in the bankrupt and groaning South. At the end of the Depression, his wealth had been nothing but a handful of controlling interests, bought at abysmally low prices, saleable only at lower prices still. At one point, Derwent boasted that he could liquidate completely and realize the price of a 3-year-old Chevrolet. There had been rumors, Jack recalled, that some of the means employed by Derwent to keep his head above water were less than savory. Involvement with bootlegging, prostitution in the Midwest,
smuggling in the coastal areas of the South, where his fertilizer factories were, finally in association with the nascent Western gambling interests. Probably Derwent's most famous investment was the purchase of the foundering Top Mark Studios, which had not had a hit since their child star, little Marjorie Morris, had died of a heroin overdose in 1934. She was 14. Little Marjorie, who had specialized in sweet 7-year-olds who saved marriages and the lives of dogs unjustly accused of killing chickens, had been given the biggest Hollywood funeral in history by Top Mark. The official story was that little Marjorie had contracted a wasting disease while entertaining at a New York orphanage, and some cynics suggested the studio had laid out all that long green because it knew it was burying itself. Derwent hired a keen businessman and raging sex maniac named Henry Finkel to run Top Mark, and in the 2 years before Pearl Harbor, the studio ground out 60 movies, 55 of which glided right into the face of the Hayes office and spit on its large blue nose. The other 5 were government training films. The feature films were huge successes. During one of them, an unnamed costume designer had jury-rigged a strapless bra for the heroine to appear in during the grand ball scene, where she revealed everything except possibly the birthmark just below the cleft of her buttocks. Derwent received credit for this invention as well, and his reputation, or notoriety, grew. The war had made him rich, and he was still rich, living in Chicago, seldom seen except for Derwent Enterprises board meetings, which he ran with an iron hand. It was rumored that he owned United Airlines Las Vegas, where he was known to have controlling interests in 4 hotel casinos and some involvement in at least 6 others, Los Angeles and the USA itself. Reputed to be a friend of royalty, presidents, and underworld kingpins, it was supposed by many that he was the richest man in the world. But he had not been able to make a go of the Overlook, Jack thought. He put the scrapbook down for a moment and took the small notebook and mechanical pencil he always kept with him out of his breast pocket. He jotted, "Look into H. Derwent, Sidewinder Library." He put the notebook back and picked up the scrapbook again. His face was preoccupied, his eyes distant. He wiped his mouth constantly with his hand as he turned the pages. He skimmed the material that followed, making a mental note to read it more closely later. Press releases were pasted into many of the pages. So-and-so was expected at the Overlook next week. Thus and such would be entertaining in the lounge. In Derwent's time, it had been the Red Eye Lounge. Many of the entertainers were Vegas names, and many of the guests were Top Mark executives and stars. Then, in a clipping marked February 1st, 1952, "Millionaire exec to sell Colorado investments. Deal made with California investors on Overlook. Other investments, Derwent reveals." By Rodney Conklin, financial editor. In a terse communique yesterday from the Chicago offices of the monolithic Derwent Enterprises, it was revealed that millionaire, perhaps billionaire, Horace Derwent has sold out of Colorado in a stunning financial power play that will be completed by October 1st, 1954. Derwent's investments include natural gas, coal, hydroelectric power, and a land development company called Colorado Sunshine Incorporated, which owns or holds options on better than 500,000 acres of Colorado land. The most famous Derwent holding in Colorado, the Overlook Hotel, has already been sold, Derwent revealed in a rare interview yesterday. The buyer was a California group of investors headed by Charles Grondin, a former director of the California Land Development Corporation. While Derwent refused to discuss price, informed sources he had sold out everything, lock, stock, and barrel. It wasn't just the Overlook, but somehow, he wiped his lips with his hands and wished he had a drink. This would go better with a drink. He turned more pages. The California group had opened the hotel for 2 seasons and then sold it to a Colorado group called Mountain View Resorts. Mountain View went bankrupt in 1957 amid charges of corruption, nest feathering, and cheating the stockholders. The president of the company shot himself 2 days after being subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury. The hotel had been closed for the rest of the decade. There was a single story about it. A Sunday feature headlined, "Former Grand Hotel Sinking into Decay." The accompanying photos wrenched at Jack's heart. The paint on the front porch peeling. The lawn a bald and scabrous mess. Windows broken by storms and stones. This would be part of the book, if he actually wrote it too. The phoenix going down into the ashes to be reborn. He promised himself he would take care of the place. Very good care. It seemed that before today, he had never really understood the breadth of his responsibility to the Overlook. It was almost like having a responsibility to history. In 1961, 4 writers, 2 of them Pulitzer Prize winners, had leased the Overlook and reopened it as a writer's school. That had lasted 1 year. One of the students had gotten drunk in his 3rd-floor room, crashed out of the window somehow, and fell to his death on the cement terrace below. The paper hinted that it might have been a suicide. "Any big hotels have got scandals," Watson had said. "Just like every big hotel has got a ghost. Why? Hell, people just come and go." Suddenly it seemed that he could almost feel the weight of the Overlook bearing down on him from above. 110 guest rooms, the storage rooms, kitchen, pantry, freezer, lounge, ballroom, dining room. In the room the women come and go, and the Red Death held sway over all. He rubbed his lips and turned to the next page in the scrapbook. He was in the last third of it now, and for the first time he wondered consciously whose book this was, left atop the highest pile of records in the cellar. A new headline, this one dated April 10th, 1963. Las Vegas group buys famed Colorado hotel, Scenic Overlook to become Key Club. Robert T. Leffing, spokesman for a group of investors going under the name of High Country Investments, announced today in Las Vegas that High Country has negotiated a deal for the famous Overlook Hotel, a resort located high in the Rockies. Leffing declined to mention the names of specific investors, but said the hotel would be turned into an exclusive Key Club. He said that the group he represents hopes to sell memberships to high-echelon executives in American and foreign companies. High Country also owns hotels in Montana, Wyoming, and Utah. The Overlook became world-known in the years 1946 to 1952, when it was owned by elusive mega-millionaire Horace DeWint, who... The item on the next page was a mere squib, dated 4 months later. The Overlook had opened under its new management. Apparently the paper hadn't been able to find out or wasn't interested in who the key holders were, because no name was mentioned but High Country Investments, the most anonymous-sounding company name Jack had ever heard, except for a chain of bike and appliance shops in western New England that went under the name Business Incorporated. He turned the page and blinked down at the clipping pasted there. Millionaire Derwent back in Colorado via back door. High Country exec revealed to be Charles Grondin, by Rodney Conklin, financial editor. The Overlook Hotel, a scenic pleasure palace in the Colorado high country, and once the private plaything of millionaire Horace Derwent, as is at the center of a financial tangle, which is only now beginning to come to light. On April 10th of last year, the hotel was purchased by a Las Vegas firm, High Country Investments, as a Key Club for wealthy executives of both foreign and domestic breeds. Now informed sources say that High Country is headed by Charles Grondin, 53,
who was the head of California Land Development Corporation until 1959, when he resigned to take the position of Executive VP in the Chicago Home Office for Derwent Enterprises. This has led to speculation that High Country Investments may be controlled by Derwent, who may have acquired the Overlook for the second time and under decidedly peculiar circumstances. Grandin, who was indicated and acquitted on charges of tax evasion in 1960, could not be reached for comment, and Horace Durant, who guards his own privacy jealously, had no comment when reached by telephone. State Representative Dick Bowes of Golden has called for a complete investigation into.
That clipping was dated July 27th, 1964. The next was a column from a Sunday paper that September. The byline belonged to Josh Branniger, a muckraking investigator of the Jack Anderson breed. Jack vaguely recalled that Branniger had died in 1969 or 68.
Mafia Free Zone, Colorado by Josh Branniger. It now seems possible that the newest R&R spot of organization overlords in the U.S. is located at an out-of-the-way hotel nestled in the center of the Rockies. The Overlook Hotel, a white elephant that has been run lucklessly by almost a dozen different groups and individuals since it first opened its doors in 1910, is now being operated as a security-jacketed key club, ostensibly for unwinding businessmen. The question is, what businesses are the Overlook's key holders really in? The members present during the week of August 16th and 23rd may give us an idea. The list below was obtained by a former employee of High Country Investments, a company first believed to be a dummy company owned by Derwent Enterprises. It now seems more likely that Derwent's interest in High Country, if any, is outweighed by those of several Las Vegas gambling barons. And these same gaming honchos have been linked in the past to both suspected and convicted underworld kingpins. Present at the Overlook during that sunny week in August were Charles Grandin, president of High Country Investments. When it became known in July of this year that he was running the High Country ship, it was announced considerably after the fact that he had resigned his position in Derwent Enterprises previously. The silver-maned Gar Rondon, who refused to talk to me for this column, has been tried once and acquitted on tax evasion charges in 1960. Charles Baby Charlie Battaglia, a 60-year-old Vegas impresario, controlling interest in the Greenback and the Lucky Bones on the Strip. Battaglia is a close personal friend of Grandin. His arrest record stretches back to 1932, when he was tried and acquitted in the gangland-style murder of Jack Dutchy Morgan. Federal authorities suspect his involvement in the drug traffic, prostitution, and murder for hire, but Baby Charlie has only been behind bars once for income tax evasion in 1955 to 56. Richard Scarn, the principal stockholder of Funtime Automatic Machines. Funtime makes slot machines for the Nevada crowd, pinball machines, and jukeboxes, Melody Coin, for the rest of the country. He has done time for assault with a deadly weapon, 1940, carrying a concealed weapon, 1948, and conspiracy to commit tax fraud, 1961. Peter Zeiss, a Miami-based importer, now nearing 70. For the last 5 years, Zeiss has been fighting deportation as an undesirable person. He has been convicted on charges of receiving and concealing stolen property, 1958, and conspiracy to commit tax fraud, 1954. Charming, distinguished, and courtly, Pete Zeiss is called Papa by his intimates, and has been tried on charges of murder and accessory to murder. A large stockholder in Scarn's Funtime Company. He is also known investments interests in 4 Las Vegas casinos. Vittorio Gianelli, also known as Vito the Chopper, tried twice for gangland-style murders, one of them axe murder of Boston Vice Overlord Frank Scoffey.
Gianelli has been indicted 23 times, tried 14 times, and convicted only once for shoplifting in 1940. It has been said that in recent years, Gianelli has become a power in the organization's Western operation, which is centered in Las Vegas. Carl Jimmy Ricks Prashkin, a San Francisco investor, reputed to be heir apparent of the power Gianelli now wields. Prashkin owns large blocks of stock in Derwent Enterprises, High Country Investments, Fun Time Automatic Machines, and 3 Vegas casinos. Prashkin is clean in America, but was indicted in Mexico on fraud charges that were dropped quickly 3 weeks after they were brought. It has been suggested that Prashkin may be in charge of laundering money skimmed from Vegas casino operations and funneling the big bucks back into the organization's legitimate Western operations. And such operations may now include the Overlook Hotel in Colorado. Other visitors during the current season include...
There was more, but Jack only skimmed it, constantly wiping his lips with his hand. A banker with Las Vegas connections. Men from New York who are apparently doing more in the garment district than making clothes. Men reputed to be involved with drugs, vice, robbery, murder. God, what a story. And they'd all been here, right above him, in those empty rooms. Screwing expensive whores on the 3rd floor, maybe. Drinking magnums of champagne. Making deals that would turn over millions of dollars, maybe in the very suite of rooms where presidents have stayed. There was a story, all right. One hell of a story. A little frantically, he took out his notebook and jotted down another memo to check all these people out at the library in Denver when the caretaking job was over. Every hotel has its ghost. The Overlook had a whole coven of them. First suicide, then the mafia. What next? The next clipping was an angry denial of Branniger's charges by Charles Grondin. Jack smirked at it. The clipping on the next page was so large that it had been folded. Jack unfolded it and gasped harshly. The picture there seemed to leap out at him. The wallpaper had been changed since June of 1966, but he knew that window and the view perfectly well. It was the western exposure of the presidential suite. Murder came next. The sitting room wall by the door leading into the bedroom was splashed with blood and what could only be white flecks of brain matter. A blank-faced cop was standing over a corpse hidden by a blanket. Jack stared, fascinated, and then his eyes moved up to the headline. Gangland-style shooting at Colorado Hotel. Reputed crime overlord shot at Mountain Key Club. 2 others dead. Sidewinder, Colorado. 40 miles from this sleepy Colorado town, a gangland-style execution has occurred in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. The Overlook Hotel, purchased 3 years ago as an exclusive key club by a Las Vegas firm, was the site of a triple shotgun slaying. 2 of the men were either the companions or bodyguards of Vittorio Gianelli, also known as the Chopper, for his reputed involvement in a Boston slaying 20 years ago. Police were summoned by Robert Norman, manager of the Overlook, who said he heard shots and that some of the guests reported 2 men wearing stockings on their faces and carrying guns had fled down the fire escape and driven off in a late Model Tan convertible. State Trooper Benjamin Moorer discovered 2 dead men, later identified as Victor T. Borman and Roger McCasey, both of Las Vegas, outside the door of the presidential suite, where 2 American presidents have stayed. Inside, Moorer found the body of Gianelli sprawled on the floor,
Gianelli was apparently fleeing his attackers when he was cut down. Moorer said Gianelli had been shot with heavy-gauge shotguns at close range. Charles Grandin, the representative of the company, which now owns the Overlook, could not be reached for...
Below the clipping, in heavy strokes of a ballpoint pen, someone had written, "They took his balls along with them." Jack stared at that for a long time, feeling cold. Whose book was this? He turned the page at last, swallowing, a click in his throat. Another column from Josh Branniger. This one dated early 1967. He only read the headline. "Notorious Hotel Sold Following Murder of Underworld Figure." The sheets following that clipping were blank. They took his balls along with them. He flipped back to the beginning, looking for a name or address, even a room number, because he felt quite sure that whoever had kept this little book of memories had stayed at the hotel. But there was nothing. He was getting ready to go through all the clippings more closely this time when a voice called down the stairs. "Jack, hon?" Wendy. He stared almost guiltily, as if he had been drinking secretly, and she would smell the fumes on him. Ridiculous. He scrubbed his lips with his hand and called back, "Yeah, babe. Looking for rats." She was coming down. He heard her on the stairs, then crossing the boiler room. Quickly, without thinking why he might be doing it, he stuffed the scrapbook under a pile of bills and invoices. He stood up as she came through the arch. "What in the world have you been doing down here? It's almost 3 o'clock. He smiled. "Oh, is it that late? I got rooted around through all this stuff, trying to find out where the bodies are buried, I guess." The words clanged back viciously in his mind. She came closer, looking at him, and he unconsciously retreated a step, unable to help himself. He knew what she was doing. She was trying to smell liquor on him. Probably she wasn't even aware of it herself, but he was, and it made him feel both guilty and angry. "Your mouth is bleeding," she said in a curious flat tone. "Huh?" He put his hand to his lips and winced at the thin stinging. His index finger came away bloody. His guilt increased. "Have you been rubbing your mouth again?" she said. He looked down and shrugged. "Yeah, I guess I have." "It's been hell for you, hasn't it?" No, not so bad." "Has it gotten any easier?" He looked up at her and made his feet start moving. Once they were actually in motion, it was easier. He crossed to his wife and slipped an arm around her waist. He brushed aside a sheaf of her blonde hair and kissed her neck. "Yes," he said. "Where's Danny?" "Oh, he's around somewhere. It started to cloud up outside. Hungry?" He slipped a hand over her taut jeans-clad bottom with counterfeit lechery. "Like the bear, madame." "Watch out, slugger. Don't start something you can't finish."
Fig, madame,"
he asked, still rubbing.
"Dirty pictures, unnatural positions."
As they went through the arch, he threw one glance back at the box where the scrapbook, Whose, was hidden. With the light out, it was only a shadow. He was relieved that he had gotten Wendy away. His lust became less acted, more natural as they approached the stairs. "Maybe," she said, "after we get you a sandwich." "Yeek!" She twisted away from him, giggling. "That tickles."
"It tickles nothing like Jack Torrance would like to tickle you, madame."
"Lay off, Jock. How about a ham and cheese for the first course?" They went up the stairs together, and Jack didn't look over his shoulder again, but he thought of Watson's words.
"Every big hotel got ghosts. Why? Hell, people come and go."
Then Wendy shut the basement door behind them, closing it into darkness. Chapter 19. Outside 217. Danny was remembering the words of someone else who had worked at the Overlook during the season. Her saying she'd seen something in one of the rooms where a bad thing happened. That was in room 217. And I want you to promise me you won't go in there, Danny. Steer right clear. It was a perfectly ordinary door, no different from any other door on the first 2 floors of the hotel. It was dark gray, halfway down a corridor that ran at right angles to the main second-floor hallway. The numbers on the door looked no different from those house numbers on the Boulder apartment building they had lived in. A 2, a 1, and a 7. Big deal. Just below them was a tiny glass circle, a peephole. Danny had tried several of them. From the inside, he got a wide, fish-eye view of the corridor. From outside, you could screw up your eye 7 ways to Sunday and still not see a thing. A dirty gyp. Why are you here? After the walk behind the Overlook, he and Mommy had come back and she had fixed him his favorite lunch, a cheese and bologna sandwich plus Campbell's bean soup. They ate in Dick's kitchen and talked. The radio was on, getting thin and crackly music from the Estes Park station. The kitchen was his favorite place in the hotel, and he guessed that Mommy and Daddy must feel the same way, because after trying their meals in the dining room for 3 days or so, they had begun eating in the kitchen by mutual consent, setting up chairs around Dick Halloran's butcher block, which was almost as big as their dining room table back in Stovington. The dining room had been too depressing, even with the lights on and the music playing from the tape cassette system in the office. You were still just one of 3 people sitting at a table surrounded by dozens of other tables, all empty, all covered with those transparent plastic dust cloths. Mommy said it was like having dinner in the middle of a Horace Walpole novel, and Daddy had laughed and agreed. Danny had no idea who Horace Walpole was, but he did know that Mommy's cooking and had begun to taste better as soon as they began to eat it in the kitchen. He kept discovering little flashes of Dick Halloran's personality lying around, and they reassured him like a warm touch. Mommy had eaten half a sandwich, no soup. She said Daddy must have gone out for a walk of his own, since both the VW and the hotel truck were in the parking lot. She said she was tired and might lie down for an hour or so, if he thought he could amuse himself and not get into trouble. Danny told her around a mouthful of cheese and bologna, then he thought he could. Why don't you go out and play in the playground? She asked him. I thought you'd love that place with the sandbox for your trucks and all. He swallowed, and the food went down his throat in a lump that was dry and hard. Maybe I will, he said, turning to her radio and fiddling with it. And all those neat hedge animals, she said, taking his empty plate. Your father's got to get out and trim them pretty soon. Yeah, he said. Just nasty things. Once it had to do with those damn hedges clipped to look like animals. If you see your father before I do, tell him I'm lying down. Sure, Mom. She put the dirty dishes in the sink and came back over to him. Are you happy here, Danny? He looked at her guilelessly, a milk mustache on his lip. Uh-huh. No more bad dreams? No. Tony had come to him once, one night while he was lying in bed, calling his name faintly from far away. Danny had squeezed his eyes tightly shut until Tony had gone. You sure? Yes, Mom. She seemed satisfied. How's your hand? He flexed it for her. All better? She nodded. Jack had taken the nest under the Pyrex bowl full of frozen wasps out to the incinerator in back of the equipment shed and burned it. They had seen no more wasps since. He had written to a lawyer in Boulder, enclosing the snaps of Danny's hand, and the lawyer had called back 2 days ago. That had put Jack in a foul temper all afternoon. The lawyer doubted if the company that had manufactured the bug bomb could be sued successfully because there was only Jack to testify that he had followed directions printed on the package. Jack had asked the lawyer if they couldn't purchase some others and test them for the same defect. Yes, the lawyer said, but the results were highly doubtful, even if the test bombs malfunctioned. He told Jack of a case that involved an extension ladder company and a man who had broken his back. Wendy had commiserated with Jack, but privately she had just been glad that Danny had gotten off as cheaply as he had. It was best to leave lawsuits to people who had understood them. And that didn't include the Torrances. And they had seen no more wasps since. Go and play, Doc. Have fun. But he hadn't had fun. He had wandered aimlessly around the hotel, poking into the maids' closets and janitors' rooms, looking for something interesting, not finding it. A small boy padding along a dark blue carpet woven in with twisting black lines. He had tried a room door from time to time, but of course they were all locked. The passkey was hanging down in the office. He knew where, but Daddy had told him he shouldn't touch that. And he didn't want to. Did he? Why are you here? There was nothing aimless about it after all. He had been drawn to room 217 by a morbid kind of curiosity. He remembered a story Daddy had read to him once when he was drunk. That had been a long time ago, but the story was just as vivid now as when Daddy had read it to him. Mommy had scolded Daddy and asked what he was doing reading a 3-year-old baby something so horrible. The name of the story was Bluebeard. That was clear in his mind, too, because he had thought at first Daddy was saying bluebird. And there were no bluebirds in the story, or birds of any kind for that matter. Actually, the story was about Bluebeard's wife, a pretty lady that had corn-colored hair like Mommy. After Bluebeard married her, they lived in a big and ominous castle that was not unlike the Overlook. And every day Bluebeard went off to work, and every day he would tell his pretty little wife not to look in a certain room, although the key to that room was hanging right on a hook, just like the passkey was hanging on the office wall downstairs. Bluebeard's wife had gotten more and more curious about the locked room. She tried to peep through the keyhole the way Danny had tried to look through the room 217's peephole with similar to unsatisfying results. There was even a picture of her getting down on her knees and trying to look under the door, but the crack wasn't wide enough. The door swung wide, and the old fairy tale book had depicted her discovery in ghastly, loving detail.
The image was burned in Danny's mind. The severed heads of Bluebeard's 7 previous wives were in the room, each one on its own pedestal. The eyes turned up to whites, the mouths unhinged and gaping in silent screams. They were somehow balanced on necks ragged from the broadsword's decapitating swing, and there was blood running down the pedestals. Terrified, she had turned to flee from the room and the castle, only to discover Bluebeard standing in the doorway, his terrible eyes blazing.
"I told you not to enter this room,"
Bluebeard said, unsheathing his sword.
"Alas, in your curiosity, you're like the other 7. And though I loved you best of all, your ending shall be as was theirs. Prepare to die, wretched woman."
It seemed vaguely to Danny that the story had had a happy ending, but that had paled in its significance. 2 insignificants beside the 2 dominant images, the taunting, maddening locked door with some great secret behind it, and the grisly secret itself, repeated more than half a dozen times. The locked door, and behind it the heads. The severed heads. His hand reached out and stroked the room's doorknob, almost furtively. He had no idea how long he had been there, standing hypnotized before the bland, gray locked door. And maybe 3 times I've thought I've seen things. Nasty things. But Mr. Halloran, Dick, had also said that he didn't think those things could hurt you. They were like scary pictures in a book, that was all. And maybe he wouldn't see anything. On the other hand, he plunged his left hand into his pocket and came out holding the passkey. It had been there all along, of course. He held it by the square metal tab on the end, which had "Office" printed on it in magic marker. He twirled the key on its chain, watching it go around and around. After several minutes of this, he stopped and slipped the passkey into the lock. It slid in smoothly, with no hitch, as if it had wanted to be there all along. "I thought I've seen those things. Nasty things. Promise me you won't go in there." "I promise." And a promise was, of course, very important. Still, his curiosity itched at him as maddeningly as poison ivy in a place you aren't supposed to scratch. But it was a dreadful kind of curiosity. The kind that makes you want to peek through your fingers during the scariest parts of a scary movie. What was behind that door? What was beyond it would be no movie. "I don't think those things can hurt you. Like scary pictures in a book." Suddenly he reached out with his left hand, not sure of what it was going to do, until he removed the passkey and stuffed it back into his pocket. He stared at the door a moment longer, blue-gray eyes wide, then turned quickly and walked back down the corridor toward the main hallway that ran at right angles to the corridor he was in. Something made him pause there, and he wasn't sure what for a moment. And then he remembered that directly around this corner on the way back to the stairs, there was one of those old-fashioned fire extinguishers curled up against the wall. Curled there like a dozing snake. They weren't chemical-type extinguishers at all, Daddy said, although there were several of those in the kitchen. These were the forerunner of the modern sprinkler systems. The long canvas hoses hooked directly onto the Overlook's plumbing system, and by turning a single valve, you could become a one-man fire department. And Daddy said that the chemical extinguishers, which sprayed foam or CO2, were much better. The chemicals smothered fires, took away the oxygen they needed to burn, while a high-pressure spray might just spread the flames around. Daddy said that Mr. Ullman should replace the old-fashioned hoses right along with the old-fashioned boiler. But Mr. Ullman probably do neither because he was a cheap prick. Danny knew that this was one of the worst epithets his father could summon. It was applied to certain doctors, dentists, and appliance repairmen, and also to the head of his English department at Stovington, who had disallowed some of Daddy's book orders because he said the books would put them over budget. Over budget, hell, he had fumed to Wendy. Danny had been listening from his bedroom where he was supposed to be asleep. He's just saying the last $500 for himself, the cheap prick. Danny looked around the corner. The extinguisher was there. A flat hose folded back a dozen times on itself. The red tank attached to the wall. Above it was an axe in a glass case, like a museum exhibit, with white words printed on a red background. In case of emergency, break glass. Danny could read the word emergency, which was also the name of one of his favorite TV shows, but was unsure of the rest. But he didn't like the way the word was used in connection with that long flat hose. Emergency was fire, explosions, car crashes, hospitals, sometimes death. He didn't like the way that hose hung there so blandly on the wall. When he was alone, he always skittered past these extinguishers as fast as he could. No particular reason. It just felt better to go fast. It felt safer. Now, heart thumping loudly in his chest, he came around the corner and looked down the hall past the extinguisher to the stairs. Mommy was down there sleeping, and Daddy was back from his walk. He would probably be sitting in the kitchen, eating a sandwich and reading a book. He would just walk right past that old extinguisher and go downstairs. He started toward it, moving closer to the far wall until his right arm was brushing the expensive silk wallpaper. 20 steps away, 15, a dozen. When he was 10 steps away, the brass nozzle suddenly rolled off the fat loop that it had been lying sleeping on and fell to the hall carpet with a dull thump. It lay there, the dark bore of its muzzle pointing at Danny. He stopped immediately, his shoulders twitching forward with the suddenness of his scare. His blood thumped thickly in his ears and temples. His mouth had gone dry and sour. His hands curled into fists, yet the nozzle of the hose only lay there, its brass casing glowing mellowly, a loop of flat canvas leading back up to the red-painted frame bolted to the wall. So it had fallen off. So what? It was only a fire extinguisher, nothing else. It was stupid to think that it looked like some poison snake from Wide World of Animals that had heard him and woken up. Even if the stitched canvas did look a little bit like scales, he'd just step over it and go down the hall to the stairs, walking a little bit fast maybe, to make sure it didn't snap out after him and curl around his foot. He wiped his lips with his left hand, in unconscious imitation of his father, and took a step forward. No movement from the hose. Another step. Nothing. There. See how stupid you are? You got all worked up thinking about that dumb room, and that dumb Bluebeard story, and that hose was probably ready to fall off for the last 5 years, that's all. Danny stared at the hose on the floor, thought of wasps. 8 steps away, the nozzle of the hose gleamed peacefully at him from the rug as if to say, "Don't worry, I'm just a hose, that's all. And even if that isn't all, oh,
Well, what I do to you won't be much worse than a bee sting or a wasp sting. Well, what I want to do to a nice little boy like you, except bite and bite and bite. Danny took another step and another. His breath was dry, harsh in his throat. Panic was close now. He began to wish the hose would move. Then at least he would know, he'd be sure. He took another step, and now he was within striking distance. But it's not going to strike at you, he thought hysterically. How can it strike at you, bite at you? It's just a hose. Maybe it's full of wasps. His internal temperature plummeted to a 10 below zero. He stared at the black bore in the center of the nozzle, nearly hypnotized. Maybe it was full of wasps, secret wasps. Their brown bodies bloated with poison, so full of autumn poison that it dripped from their stingers in clear drops of fluid. Suddenly he knew he was frozen, nearly frozen with terror. If he did not make his feet go now, they would become locked to the carpet, and he would stay there, staring at the black hole in the center of the brass nozzle like a bird staring at a snake. He would stay there until his daddy found him, and then what would happen? With a high moan, he made himself run. As he reached the hose, some trick of the light made the hose nozzle seem to move, to revolve as if to strike, and he leaped high in the air above it. In his panicky state, it seemed that his legs pushed him nearly all the way to the ceiling, that he could feel the stiff back hairs that formed as cowlick brushing the hallway's plaster ceiling, although later he knew that couldn't have been so. He came down on the other side of the hose and ran, and suddenly he heard it behind him, coming for him, the soft, dry wicker of that brass snake's head as it slithered rapidly along the carpet after him like a rattlesnake, moving swiftly through a dry field of grass. It was coming for him, and suddenly the stairs seemed very far away. They seemed to retreat a running step into the distance for each running step he took toward them. "Daddy!" He tried to scream, but his closed throat would not allow a word to pass. He was on his own. Behind him, the sound grew louder. The dry, sliding sound of the snake, slipping swiftly over the carpet's dry hackles. At his heels now, perhaps rising up with clear poison dribbling from his brass snout. Danny reached the stairs and had to pinwheel his arms crazily for balance. For one moment it seemed sure that he would cartwheel over and go head for heels to the bottom. He threw a glance back over his shoulder. The hose had not moved. It lay as it had lain, one loop off the frame, the brass nozzle on the hall floor, the nozzle pointing disinterestedly away from him. "You see? Stupid." He berated himself. "You made it all up, scaredy cat. It was all your imagination, scaredy cat, scaredy cat." He clung to the stairway railing, his legs trembling in reaction. "It never chased you," his mind told him, and seized on that thought and played it back. "Never chased you, never chased you, never did, never did." It was nothing to be afraid of. Why, he could go back and put that hose right into its frame if he wanted to. He could, but he didn't think he would. Because what if it had chased him and had gone back when he saw it couldn't quite catch him? The hose lay on the carpet, almost seeming to ask him if he would like to come back and try again. Panting, Danny ran downstairs. Chapter 20. Talking to Mr. Allman. Sidewinder Public Library was a small retiring building 1 block down from the town's business area. It was a modest vine-covered building, and the wide concrete walk up to the door was lined with the corpses of last summer's flowers. On the lawn was a large bronze statue of a Civil War general Jack had never heard of, although he had been something of a Civil War buff in his teenage years. The newspaper files were kept downstairs. They consisted of Sidewinder Gazette that had gone bust in 1963, the Estes Park Daily, and the Boulder Camera. No Denver papers at all. Sighing, Jack settled for the Camera. When the files reached 1965, the actual newspapers were replaced by spools of microfilm. A federal grant, the librarian told him brightly.
We hope to do 1958 to 64 when the next check comes through. But they're slow, aren't they? You will be careful, won't you? I just know you will. Call if you need me.
The only reading machine had a lens that had somehow gotten warped. By the time Wendy put her hand on his shoulder, some 45 minutes after he had switched from the actual papers, he had a juicy thumper of a headache.
Danny's in the park, she said. But I don't want him outside too long. How much longer do you think you'll be?
10 minutes, he said. Actually, he had traced down the last of the Overlook's fascinating history, the years between the gangland shooting and the takeover by Stuart Ullman and Company. But he felt the same reticence about telling Wendy.
What are you up to, anyway?
She asked. She ruffled his hair as she said it, but her voice was only half teasing. Looking up some old Overlook history, he said.
Any particular reason?
No. Why the hell are you so interested anyway? Just curiosity.
Find anything interesting?
Not much, he said, having to strive to keep his voice pleasant now. She was prying. Just the way she'd always pried and poked at him when they'd been at Stovington, and Danny was still a crib infant. Where are you going, Jack? When will you be back? How much money do you have with you? Are you going to take the car? Is Al going to be with you? When do you stay sober? On and on. She had pardoned the expression, driven him to drink. Maybe that hadn't been the only reason, but by Christ, let's tell the truth here, and admit it was one of them. Nag and nag and nag until you wanted to clout her one just to shut her up and stop the where, when, how, are you, will you, endless flow of questions. It could give you a real headache, hangover, headache. The reader. The damned reader with its distorted print. That was why he had such a cunt of a headache.
Jack, are you all right? You look pale.
He snapped his head away from her fingers. I'm fine. She recoiled from his hot eyes and tried on a smile that was a size too small.
Well, if you are, I'll just go and wait in the park with Danny.
She was starting away now, her smile dissolving into a bewildered expression of hurt. He called to her, Wendy? She looked back from the foot of the stairs.
What, Jack?
He got up and went over to her. I'm sorry, babe. I guess I'm really not all right. That machine, the lens is distorted. I've got a really bad headache. You got any aspirin?
Sure.
She pawed in her purse and came up with a tin of Anacin.
You keep them.
He took the tin. No Excedrin? He saw the small recoil on her face and understood. It had been a bitter sort of joke between them at first, before the drinking had gotten too bad for jokes. He had claimed that Excedrin was the only non-prescription drug ever invented that could stop a hangover dead in its tracks. Absolutely the only one. He had begun to think of this morning after Thumpers as Excedrin headache number VAT 69. No Excedrin, she said. Sorry. Ah, that's okay. These'll do just fine. But of course they wouldn't. And she should have known that, too. At times she could be the stupidest bitch. You want some water? She asked brightly. No, I just want you to get the fuck out of here. I'll get some at the drinking fountain when I go up, thanks. Okay. She started up the stairs, good legs moving gracefully under a short tan wool skirt. We'll be in the park. Right. He slipped the tin of Anacin absently into his pocket, went back to the reader, and turned it off. When he was sure she was gone, he went upstairs himself. God, but it was a lousy headache. If you're going to have a vice gripper like this one, you ought to at least be allowed the pleasure of a few drinks to balance it off. He tried to put the thought far from his mind, more ill-tempered than ever. He went to the main desk, fingering a matchbook cover with a telephone number on it. Ma'am, do you have a pay telephone? No, sir, but you can use mine if it's local. It's long distance, sorry. Well, then I guess the drugstore would be your best bet. They have a booth. Thanks. He went out and down the walk past the anonymous Civil War general. He began to walk toward the business block, hands stuffed in his pockets, head thudding like a leaden bell. The sky was also leaden. It was November 7th. And with the new month, the weather had become threatening. There had been a number of snow flurries. There had been snow in October, too, but that had melted. The new flurries had stayed, a light frosting over everything. It sparkled in the sunlight like fine crystal. But there had been no sunlight today, and even as he reached the drugstore, it began to spit snow again. The phone booth was at the back of the building, and he was halfway down an aisle of patent medicines, jingling his change in his pocket, when his eyes fell on the white boxes with their green print. He took one of them to the cashier, paid, and went back to the telephone booth. He pulled the door closed, put his change and matchbook cover on the counter, and dialed 0. Your call, please. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, operator. He gave her the number there and the number in the booth. When she told him it would be $1.90 for the first 3 minutes, he dropped 8 quarters into the slot, wincing each time the bell bonged in his ear. Then, left in limbo, with only the faraway clickings and gabblings of connection-making, he took the green bottle of Excedrin out of its box, pried up the white cap, and dropped the wad of cotton batting to the floor of the booth. Cradling the phone receiver between his ear and shoulder, he shook out 3 of the white tablets and lined them up on the counter beside his remaining change. He recapped the bottle and put it in his pocket. At the other end, the phone was picked up on the first ring. Surf Sand Resort, how may we help you? The perky female voice asked. I'd like to speak with the manager, please. Do you mean Mr. Trent, or? I mean Mr. Ullman. I believe Mr. Ullman is busy, but if you'd like me to check... I would. Tell him it's Jack Torrance calling from Colorado. One moment, please. She put him on hold. Jack's dislike for that cheap, self-important little prick Ullman came flooding back. He took one of the Excedrin from the counter, regarded it for a moment, then put it into his mouth and began to chew it, slowly and with relish. The taste flooded back like memory, making his saliva squirt in mingled pleasure and happiness. A dry, bitter taste, but a compelling one. He swallowed with a grimace. Chewing aspirin had been a habit with him in his drinking days. He hadn't done it at all since then. But when your headache was bad enough, a hangover headache or one like this one, chewing them seemed to make them get to work quicker.
He had read somewhere that chewing aspirin could become addictive. Where had he read that anyway? Frowning, he tried to think, and then Ullman came on the line.
Torrance, what's the trouble?
No trouble, he said. The boiler's okay, and I haven't even gotten around to murdering my wife yet. I'm saving that until after the holidays, when things get dull.
Very funny. Why are you calling? I'm a busy
man, yes, I understand that. I'm calling about some things that you didn't tell me about during your history of the Overlook's great and honorable past. Like how Horace Derwent sold it to a bunch of Las Vegas sharpies who dealt it through so many dummy corporations that not even the IRS knew who really owned it. About how they waited until the time was right and then turned it into a playground for mafia bigwigs. And how it had been shut down in 1966 when one of them got a little bit, dead, along with his bodyguards who were standing outside the door to the presidential suite. Great place, the Overlook's presidential suite. Wilson, Harding, Roosevelt, Nixon, and Vito the Chopper, right? There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end of the line. Then Ullman said quietly,
I don't see how that can have any bearing on your job, Mr. Torrance.
The best part happened after Gianelli was shot, though. Don't you think? 2 more quick shuffles. Now you see it, now you don't. And then the Overlook is suddenly owned by a private citizen, a woman named Sylvia Hunter, who just happened to be Sylvia Hunter Derwent from 1942 to 1948.
Your 3 minutes is up, the operator said. Signal went through. My dear Torrance, all of this is public knowledge, an ancient history.
It formed no part of my knowledge, Jack said. I doubt if many other people know it either. Not all of it. They remember the Gianelli shooting. Maybe. But I doubt if anyone has put together all the wondrous and strange shuffles the Overlook has been through since 1945. And it always seems like Derwent or a Derwent associate comes up with the door prize. What was Sylvia Hunter running up there in 67 and 68, Mr. Ullman? It was a whorehouse, wasn't it?
Torrance! His shot crackled across 2,000 miles of telephone cable without losing a thing.
Smiling, Jack popped another Excedrin into his mouth and chewed it. She sold out after a rather well-known U.S. senator died of a heart attack up there. There were rumors that he was found naked except for black nylon stockings and a garter belt and a pair of high-heeled pumps. Patent leather pumps, as a matter of fact.
That's a vicious, damnable lie,
Ullman cried. Is it? Jack asked. He was beginning to feel better. The headache was draining away. He took the last Excedrin and chewed it up, enjoying the bitter, powdery taste as the tablet shredded in his mouth.
It was a very unfortunate occurrence, Ullman said. Now what is the point, Torrance? If you're planning to write some ugly smear article, if this is some ill-conceived, stupid blackmail idea...
Nothing of the sort, Jack said. I called because I didn't think you played square with me. And because...
Didn't play square, Ullman cried. My God, did you think I was going to share a large pile of dirty laundry with a hotel's caretaker? Who in heaven's name do you think you are? And how could those old stories possibly affect you anyway? Or do you think there are ghosts parading up and down the halls of the West Wing, wearing bedsheets and crying, "Whoa"?
No, I don't think there's any ghosts. But you raked up a lot of my personal history before you gave me the job. You had me on the carpet quizzing me about my ability to take care of your hotel like a little boy in front of the teacher's desk for peering in the coat room. You embarrassed me.
I just do not believe your cheek. Your bloody damned impertinence, Ullman said.
He sounded as if he might be choking.
I'd like to sack you, and perhaps I will.
I think Al Shockley might object strenuously. And I think you might have finally overestimated Mr. Shockley's commitment to you, Mr. Torrance.
For a moment, Jack's headache came back in all its thudding glory, and he closed his eyes against the pain. As if from a distance away, he heard himself ask, "Who owns the Overlook now? Is it still Derwent Enterprises? Or are you too small fry to know?"
I think that will do, Mr. Torrance. You are an employee of the hotel, no different from a busboy or a kitchen pot scrubber. I have no intention of...
Okay, all right, Al, Jack said. He'll know. After all, he's on the board of directors. And I might just add a little P.S. to the effect that
Derwent does not own it.
What? I couldn't quite make that out.
I said Derwent does not own it. The stockholders are all Easterners. Your friend Mr. Shockley owns the largest block of stock himself. Better than 35%. You would know better than I if he was any ties to Derwent.
Who else?
I have no intention of divulging the names of other stockholders to you, Mr. Torrance. I intend to bring this whole matter to the attention of...
One other question.
I am under no obligation to you.
Most of the Overlook's history, savory and unsavory alike, I found in a scrapbook that was in the cellar. Big thing with white leather covers, gold thread for binding. Do you have any idea whose scrapbook that might be?
None at all.
Is it possible it could have belonged to Grady, the caretaker who killed himself?
Mr. Torrance,
Ullman said in tones of deepest frost,
I am by no means sure that Mr. Grady could read, let alone dig out rotten apples you have been wasting my time with.
I'm thinking of writing a book about the Overlook Hotel. I thought if I actually got through it, the owner of the scrapbook would like to have an acknowledgement on the front.
I think writing a book about the Overlook would be very unwise, especially a book done from your point of view.
Your opinion doesn't surprise me.
His headache was all gone now. There had been that one flash of pain, and that was all. His mind felt sharp and accurate, all the way down to millimeters. It was the way he usually felt, only when the writing was going extremely well or when he had a 3-drink buzz on. That was another thing he had forgotten about Excedrin. He didn't know if it worked for others, but for him, crunching 3 tablets was like an instant high. Now, he said,
what you'd like is some sort of commissioned guidebook that you could hand out free to the guests when they checked in. Something with a lot of glossy photos of the mountains at sunrise and sunset, and a lemon meringue text to go with it. Also, a section on the colorful people who have stayed there, of course excluding the really colorful ones like Gianelli and his friends.
If I felt I could fire you and be 100% certain my own job instead of just 95%,
Ullman said in clipped, strangled tones,
I would fire you right this minute over the telephone. But since I feel that 5% of uncertainty, I intend to call Mr. Shockley the moment you're off the line, which will be soon, or so I devoutly hope.
Jack said, there isn't going to be anything in the book that isn't true, you know. There's no need to dress it up.
Why are you baiting him? Do you want to be fired?
I don't care if Chapter 5 is about the Pope of Rome screwing the shade of the Virgin Mary,
Ullman said, his voice rising.
I want you out of my hotel!
It's not your hotel,
Jack screamed and slammed the receiver into its cradle. He sat on the stool breathing hard, a little scared now.
A little? Hell, a lot.
Wondering why in the name of God he called Ullman in the first place.
You lost your temper again, Jack.
Yes. Yes, he had. No sense trying to deny it. And the hell of it was, he had no idea how much influence that cheap little prick had over Al. No more than he knew how much bullshit Al would take from him in the name of Auld Lang Syne. If Ullman was as good as he claimed to be, and if he gave Al a he goes or I go ultimatum, might not Al be forced to take it? He closed his eyes and tried to imagine telling Wendy, "Guess what, babe? I lost another job. This time I had to go through 2,000 miles of Bell telephone cable to find someone to punch out, but I managed it." He opened his eyes and wiped his mouth with the handkerchief. He wanted a drink. Hell, he needed one. There was a cafe just down the street. Surely he had time for a quick beer on his way up to the park. Just one to lay the dust. He clenched his hands together helplessly. The question recurred. Why had he called Ullman in the first place? The number of the Surf Sand in Lauderdale had been written in a small notebook by the phone and the CB radio in the office. Plumbers' numbers, carpenters, glaziers, electricians, others. Jack had copied it into the matchbook cover shortly after getting out of bed. The idea of calling Ullman full-blown and gleeful in his mind. But to what purpose? Once, during the drinking phase, Wendy had accused him of desiring his own destruction, but not possessing the necessary moral fiber to support a full-blown death wish. So he manufactured ways in which other people could do it, lopping a piece at a time off himself and their family. Could it be true? Was he afraid somewhere inside that the Overlook might be just what he needed to finish his play and generally collect up his shit and get it together? Was he blowing the whistle on himself? Please, God, no, don't let it be that way. Please. He closed his eyes, and an image immediately arose on the darkened screen of his inner lids. Sticking his hand through that hole in the shingles to pull out the rotting flashing. The sudden needling sting, his own agonized, startled cry in the still and unheating air. "Oh, you goddamn fucking son of a bitch!" Replaced with an image 2 years earlier. Himself stumbling into the house at 3 a.m, drunk, falling over a table and sprawling full length on the floor, cursing, waking Wendy up on the couch. Wendy turning on the light, seeing his clothes ripped and smeared from some cloudy parking lot scuffle that had occurred at a vaguely remembered honky-tonk just over the New Hampshire border hours before. Crusted blood under his nose, now looking up at his wife, blinking stupidly in the light like a mole in the sunshine, and Wendy saying dully, "You son of a bitch, you woke Danny up. If you don't care about yourself, can't you care a little bit about us? Why do I even bother talking to you?" The telephone rang, making him jump. He snatched it off the cradle, illogically sure it must be either Ullman or Al Shockley. "What?" he barked. "Your overtime, sir. $3.50. "I'll have to break some ones," he said. "Wait a minute." He put the phone on the shelf, deposited his last 6 quarters, then went out to the cashier to get more. He performed the transaction automatically, his mind running in a single closed circle like a squirrel on an exercise wheel. Why had he called Ullman? Because Ullman had embarrassed him. He had been embarrassed before, and by real masters, the Grand Master, of course, being himself. Simply to crow at the man, expose his hypocrisy? Jack didn't think he was that petty. His mind tried to seize on the scrapbook as a valid reason. That wouldn't hold water either. The chances of Ullman knowing who the owner was were no more than 2 in 1,000. At the interview, he had treated the seller as another country, a nasty underdeveloped one at that. If he had really wanted to know, he would have called Watson. whose winter number was also in the office notebook. Even Watson would not have been a sure thing, but surer than Ullman. And telling him about the book idea, that had been another stupid thing. Incredibly stupid. Besides jeopardizing his job, he could be closing off wide channels of information once Ullman called around and told people to beware of New Englanders bearing questions about the Overlook Hotel. He could have done his researches quietly, mailing off polite letters, perhaps even arranging some interviews in the spring, and then laughed up his sleeve at Ullman's rage when the book came out, and he was safely away. The masked author strikes again. Instead, he had made that damned senseless call, lost his temper, antagonized Ullman, and brought out all the hotel manager's little Caesar tendencies. Why? If it wasn't an effort to get himself thrown out of a good job, the good job that Al had snagged for him, then what was it? He deposited the rest of the money in the slots and hung up the phone. It really was the senseless kind of thing he might have done if he had been drunk. But he had been sober. Dead, cold sober. Walking out of the drugstore, he crunched another Excedrin into his mouth, grimacing yet relishing the bitter taste. On the walk outside, he met Wendy and Danny.
"Hey, we were just coming after you," Wendy said. "Snowing, don't you know?"
Jack blinked up. So it is. It was snowing hard. Sidewinder's main street was already heavily powdered, the center line obscured. Danny had his head tilted up to the white sky, his mouth open and his tongue out to catch some of the fat flakes drifting down.
"Do you think this is it?"
Wendy asked. Jack shrugged. I don't know. I was hoping for another week or two of grace. We still might get it. Grace. That was it. I'm sorry, Al. Grace, your mercy. For your mercy. One more chance. I'm heartily sorry. How many times, over how many years, had he, a grown man, asked for the mercy of another chance? He was suddenly so sick of himself, so revolted, he could have groaned aloud.
"How's your headache?"
she asked, studying him closely. He put an arm around her and hugged her tight. Better. Come on, you two. Let's go home while we still can. They walked back to where the hotel truck was slant parked against the curb, Jack in the middle, his left arm around Wendy's shoulders, his right hand holding Danny's hand. He had called it home for the first time, for better or worse. As he got behind the truck's wheel, it occurred to him that while he was fascinated by the Overlook, he didn't much like it. He wasn't sure it was good for either his wife or his son or himself. Maybe that was why he could... Maybe that was why he had called Ullman. To be fired while there was still time. He backed the truck out of its parking space and headed them out of town and up into the mountains.
Chapter 21. Night Thoughts.
It was 10 o'clock. The corridors were filled with counterfeit sleep. Jack lay on his side, facing the wall, eyes open, listening to Wendy's slow and irregular breathing. The taste of dissolved aspirin was still on his tongue, making it feel rough and slightly numb. Al Shockley had called at 6:15, 8:15 back east. Wendy had been downstairs with Danny, sitting in front of the lobby fireplace and reading.
Person to person, the air operator said. For Mr. Jack Torrance.
Speaking. He had switched the phone to his right hand, had dug his handkerchief out of his back pocket with his left, and had wiped his tender lips with it. Then he lit a cigarette. Al's voice then, strong in his ear.
Jackie boy, what in the name of God are you up to?
Hi, Al. He snuffed the cigarette and groped for the Excedrin bottle.
What's going on, Jack? I got this weird phone call from Stuart Allman this afternoon. And when Stu Allman calls long distance out of his own pocket, you know the shit has hit the fan.
Allman has nothing to worry about, Al. Neither do you.
What exactly is the nothing we don't have to worry about? Stu made it sound like a cross between blackmail and National Enquirer feature on the Overlook. Talk to me, boy.
I wanted to poke him a little, Jack said. When I came up here to be interviewed, he had to drag out all my dirty laundry. Drinking problem, lost your last job for racking over a student, wonder if you're the right man for this, etc. The thing that bugged me, Al, was that he was bringing all this up because he loved the goddamn hotel so much. The beautiful Overlook, the traditional Overlook, the bloody sacred Overlook. Well, I found a scrapbook in the basement. Somebody had put together all the less savory aspects of Allman's cathedral, and it looked to me like a little black mass had been going on after hours.
I hope that's metaphorical, Jack.
Al's voice sounded frighteningly cold.
It is, but I didn't find out. I know the hotel's history.
Jack ran a hand through his hair. So I called him up and poked him with it. I admit it wasn't very bright, and I sure wouldn't do it again. End of story.
Stu says you're planning to do a little dirty laundry airing yourself.
Stu is an asshole. He barked into the phone. I told him I had an idea of writing about the Overlook. Yeah, I do. I think this place forms an index of the whole post-World War II American character. That sounds like an inflated claim stated so badly. I know it does. But it's all here, Al. My God, it could be a great book. But it's far in the future. I can promise you that. I got more on my plate right now than I can eat.
Jack, that's not good enough.
He found himself gaping at the black receiver of the phone, unable to believe what he had surely heard.
What? Al, did you say? I said what I said. How long is far in the future, Jack? For you, it may be 2 years, maybe 5. For me, it's 30 or 40. Because I expect to be associated with the Overlook for a long time. The thought of you doing some sort of scum job in my hotel and passing it off as a great piece of American writing, that makes me sick.
Jack was speechless.
I tried to help you, Jackie boy. We went through the war together, and I thought I owed you some help. You remember the war?
I remember it, he muttered. But the coals of resentment had begun to glow around his heart. First Ullman, then Wendy, and now Al. What was this? National Let's Pick Jack Torrance Apart Week? He clamped his lips more tightly together, reached for his cigarettes, and knocked them off onto the floor. Had he ever liked this cheap prick talking to him from his mahogany-lined den in Vermont? Had he really?
Before you hit that Hatfield kid, Al was saying, I'd talked to the board out of letting you go, and even had them swung around to considering tenure. You blew that one for yourself. I got you this hotel thing, a nice quiet place for you to get yourself together, finish your play, and wait it out until Harry Effinger and I could convince the rest of those guys they'd made a big mistake. Now it looks like you want to chew my arm off on your way to a bigger killing. Is that the way you say thanks to your friends, Jack?
No, he whispered. He didn't dare say more. His head was throbbing with the hot, acid-etched words that wanted to get out. He tried desperately to think of Danny and Wendy depending on him. Danny and Wendy sitting peacefully downstairs in front of the fire and working on the first of the second grade reading primers, thinking everything was A-OK. If he lost his job, what then? Off to California and that tired old VW with a disintegrating fuel pump like a family of Dust Bowl Okies? He told himself he would get down on his knees and beg Al before he let that happen. But still the words struggled to pour out, and the hand holding the hot wires of his rage felt greased.
What?
Al said sharply. No, he said. That's not the way I treat my friends. And you know it.
How do I know it? At the worst, you're planning to smear my hotel by digging up bodies that were decently buried years ago. At the best, you call up my temperamental but extremely competent hotel manager and work him into a frenzy as part of some stupid kid's game.
It was more than a game, Al. It's easier for you. You don't have to take some rich friend's charity. You don't need a friend in court because you are the court. The fact that you were one step from a brown bag lush goes pretty much unmentioned, doesn't it?
I suppose it does,
Al said. His voice had dropped a notch, and he sounded tired of the whole thing.
But Jack, I can't help that. I can't change that.
I know, Jack said emptily. Am I fired? I guess you better tell me if I am.
Not if you'll do two things for me.
All right.
Hadn't you better hear the conditions before you accept them?
No. Give me your deal and I'll take it. There's Wendy and Danny to think about. If you want my balls, I'll send them airmail.
Are you sure self-pity is a luxury you can afford, Jack?
He had closed his eyes and slid an Excedrin between his dry lips. At this point, I feel it's the only one I can afford. Fire away, no pun intended. Al was silent for a moment. Then he said,
First, no more calls to Ullman. Not even if the place burns down. If that happens, call the maintenance man. That guy who swears all the time. You know who I mean.
Watson.
Yes.
Okay, done.
Second, you promised me, Jack. Word of honor. No book about a famous Colorado mountain hotel with a history.
For a moment, his rage was so great that he literally could not speak. The blood beat loudly in his ears.
It was like getting a call from some 20th century Medici prince. No portraits of my family with their warts showing, please, or back to the rabble you'll go. I subsidize no pictures but pretty pictures. When you paint the daughter of my good friend and business partner, please omit birthmark, or back to the rabble you'll go. Of course we're friends. We're both civilized men, aren't we? We've shared bed and board and bottle. We'll always be friends, and the dog collar I have on you will always be ignored by mutual consent, and I'll take good and benevolent care of you. All I ask in return is your soul. Small item. We can even ignore the fact that you've handed it over, the way we ignore the dog collar. Remember, my talented friend, there are Michelangelos begging everywhere in the streets of Rome. Jack, you there? He made a strangled noise that was intended to be the word yes. Al's voice was firm and very sure of itself. I really don't think I'm asking so much, Jack. And there will be other books. You just can't expect me to subsidize you while you... All right, agreed. I don't want you to think I'm trying to control your artistic life, Jack. You know me better than that. It's just that... Al?
What?
Is Derwent still involved with the Overlook, somehow?
I don't see how that can possibly be any concern of yours, Jack.
No, he said distantly. I suppose it isn't. Listen, Al. I think I hear Wendy calling me for something. I'll get back to you.
Sure thing, Jackie boy. We'll have a good talk. How are things? Dry?
You've got your pound of flesh. You've got your pound of flesh, blood, and all. Now can't you leave me alone? As a bone.
Here, too. I'm actually beginning to enjoy sobriety.
If I'll get back. Al, Wendy.
Sure, okay.
And so he had hung up, and that was when the cramps had come, hitting him like lightning bolts, making him curl up in front of the telephone like a penitent, hands over his belly, head throbbing like a monstrous bladder. The moving wasp, having stung, moves on. It had passed a little when Wendy came upstairs and asked him who had been on the phone. Al, he said. He called to ask how things were going. I said they were fine.
Jack, you look terrible. Are you sick?
Headache's back. I'm going to bed early. No sense trying to write.
Can I get you some warm milk?
He smiled wanly. That would be nice. And now he lay beside her, feeling her warm and sleeping thigh against his own, thinking of the conversation with Al, how he had groveled, still made him hot and cold by turns. Someday there would be a reckoning. Someday there would be a book. Not the soft and thoughtful thing he had first considered, but a gem-hard work of research, photo section and all. And he would pull apart the entire Overlook history. Nasty, incestuous ownership deals and everything. He would spread it all out for the reader like a dissected crayfish. And if Al Shockley had connections with Derwent Empire, then God help him. Strung up like a piano wire, he lay staring into the dark, knowing it might be hours yet before he could sleep. Wendy Torrance lay on her back, eyes closed, listening to the sound of her husband's slumber.
The long inhale, the brief hold, the slightly guttural exhale. Where did he go when he slept, she wondered. To some amusement park? A great Barrington of dreams where all the riders were free. There was no wife, mother, along to tell them that they'd had enough hot dogs, or that they'd better be going if they wanted to get home by dark. Or was it some fathoms deep bar, where the drinking never stopped, and the bat wings were always propped open, and all the old companions were gathered around the electronic hockey game? Glasses in hand, Al Shockley prominent among them, with his tie loosened, and the top button of his shirt undone. A place where both she and Danny were excluded, and the boogie went on endlessly. Wendy was worried about him, the old helpless worry that she had hoped was behind her forever in Vermont. As if worry could somehow not cross state lines. She didn't like what the Overlook seemed to be doing to Jack and Danny. The most frightening thing was vaporous and unmentioned, perhaps unmentionable, was that all of Jack's drinking problems had come back, one by one. All but the drink itself. The constant wiping of the lips with hand or handkerchief, as if to rid them of excess moisture. Long pauses at the typewriter, more balls of paper in the wastebasket. There had been a bottle of Excedrin on the telephone table tonight after Al had called him, but no water glass. He had been chewing them again. He got irritated over little things. He would unconsciously start snapping his fingers in a nervous rhythm when things got too quiet. Increased profanity. She began to worry about his temper, too. It would almost come as a relief if he would lose it, blow off steam, in much the same way that he went down to the basement first thing in the morning and last thing at night to dump the press on the boiler. It would almost be good to see him curse and kick a chair across the room or slam a door. But those things, always an integral part of his temperament, had almost wholly ceased. Yet she had the feeling that Jack was more and more often angry with her or Danny, but was refusing to let it out. The boiler had a pressure gauge. Old, cracked, clotted with grease, but still workable. And Jack had none. She had never been able to read him very well. Danny could, but Danny wasn't talking. And the call from Al, at about the same time it had come, Danny had lost all interest in the story they had been reading. He left her to sit by the fire and crossed to the main desk where Jack had constructed a roadway for his matchbox cars and trucks. The violent violet Volkswagen was there, and Danny had begun to push it rapidly back and forth, pretending to read her own book, but actually looking at Danny over the top of it. She had seen an odd amalgam of the ways she and Jack had expressed anxiety, the wiping of the lips, running both hands nervously through his hair, as she had done while waiting for Jack to come home from his round of the bars. She couldn't believe Al had just called to ask how things were going. If you wanted to shoot the bull, you called Al. When Al called you, that was business. Later, when she'd come back downstairs, she had found Danny curled up by the fire again, reading the second-grade primer adventures of Joe and Rachel at the circus, with their daddy in complete, absorbed attention. The fidgety distraction had completely disappeared. Watching him, she had been struck again by the eerie certainty that Danny knew more and understood more than there was room for in Dr. Just Call Me Bill Edmonds' philosophy.
"Hey, time for bed, Doc," she'd said. "Yeah, okay."
He marked his place in the book and stood up.
"Wash up and brush your teeth." Okay. Don't forget to use the floss. I won't.
They stood side by side for a moment, watching the wax and wane of the coals of the fire. Most of the lobby was chilly and drafty, but this circle around the fireplace was magically warm and hard to leave. "It was Uncle Al on the phone," she said casually.
Oh, yeah?
Totally unsurprised.
I wonder if Uncle Al was mad at Daddy,
She said still casually.
Yeah, sure he was,
Danny said, still watching the fire.
He didn't want Daddy to write the book. What book, Danny? About the hotel.
The question framed on her lips was one she and Jack had asked Danny 1,000 times. How do you know that? She hadn't asked him. She didn't want to upset him before bed, or make him aware that they were casually discussing his knowledge of things he had no way of knowing at all. And he did know. She was convinced of that. Dr. Edmonds' patter about inductive reasoning and subconscious logic was just that, patter. Her sister, how had Danny known that she was thinking about Eileen in the waiting room that day? And, "I dreamed Daddy had an accident." She shook her head, as if to clear it.
Go wash up, Doc. Okay.
He ran up the stairs toward their quarters. Frowning, she had gone into the kitchen to warm Jack's milk in a saucepan. And now, lying wakeful in her bed and listening to her husband's breathing and the wind outside, miraculously, they'd only had another flurry that afternoon, still no heavy snow. She let her mind turn fully to her lovely, troubling son, born with a caul over his face, a simple tissue of membrane the doctors saw perhaps once in every 700 births, a tissue that the old wives' tales said betokened the second sight. She decided that it was time to talk to Danny about the overlook. In high time she tried to get Danny to talk to her. Tomorrow, for sure. The two of them would be going down to the Sidewinder Public Library to see if they could get some second-grade level books on an extended loan through the winter. And she would talk to him, and frankly. With that thought, she felt a little easier, and at last began to drift toward sleep. Danny lay awake in his bedroom, eyes open, left arm encircling his aged and slightly worse for wear Pooh. Pooh had lost one shoe button eye and was oozing stuffing from half a dozen sprung seams. Listening to his parents sleep in their bedroom, he felt as if he were standing unwilling guard over them. The nights were the worst of all. He hated the nights and the constant howl of the wind around the west side of the hotel. His glider floated overhead from a string. On his bureau, the VW model, brought up from the roadway set up downstairs, glowed a dimly fluorescent purple. His books were in the bookcase, his coloring books on the desk. Place for everything and everything in its place, Mommy said. Then you know where it is, where you want it. But now things have been misplaced. Things were missing. Worse still, things have been added. Things you couldn't quite see. Like in one of those pictures that said, "Can you see the Indians?" And if you strained and squinted, you could see one of them. The thing you had taken for a cactus at first was really a brave with a knife clamped in his teeth. and there were others hiding in the rocks. And you could even see one of their evil, merciless faces peering throughout the spokes of a covered wagon wheel. But you could never see all of them, and that was what made you uneasy. Because it was the ones you couldn't see that would sneak up behind you, tomahawk in one hand, a scalping knife in the other. He shifted uneasily in his bed, his eyes searching out the comforting glow of the nightlight. Things were worse here. He knew that much for sure. At first they hadn't been so bad, but little by little, his daddy thought about drinking a lot more. Sometimes he was angry at Mommy and didn't know why. He went around wiping his lips with his handkerchief, and his eyes were far away and cloudy. Mommy was worried about him and Danny too. He didn't have to shine into her to know that. It had been in the anxious way she had questioned him on the day the fire hose had seemed to turn into a snake. Mr. Halloran said he thought all mothers could shine a little bit, and she had known on that day that something had happened, but not what. He had almost told her, but a couple things had held him back. He knew that the doctor and Sidewinder had dismissed Tony, and the things that Tony showed him as perfectly, well, almost normal. His mother might not believe him if he told her about the hose. Worse, she might believe him in the wrong way. Might think he was losing his marbles. He understood a little bit about losing his marbles. Not as much as he did about getting a baby, which his mommy had explained to him the year before at some length, but not enough. But enough. Once at nursery school, his friend Scott had pointed out a boy named Robin Stinger, who was moping around the swings with a face almost long enough to step on. Robin's father taught arithmetic at Daddy's school, and Scott's daddy taught history there. Most of the kids at the nursery school were associated either with Stovington Prep or with the small IBM plant just outside of town. The prep kids chummed in one group, the IBM kids in another. There were cross friendships, of course, but it was natural enough for the kids whose fathers knew each other to more or less stick together. When there was an adult scandal in one group, it almost always filtered down to the children in some wildly mutated form or other, but it rarely jumped to the other group. He and Scotty were sitting in the play rocket ship when Scotty jerked his thumb at Robin and said, "You know that kid?"
Yeah,
Danny said. Scott leaned forward. "His dad lost his marbles last night. They took him away."
yeah? Just for losing some marbles?
Scotty looked disgusted.
You went crazy, you know.
Scott crossed his eyes, flopped out his tongue, twirled his index finger in large elliptical orbits around his ears.
They took him to the bug house. Wow, Danny said. When will they let him come back?
Never, 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 Scotty said darkly. In the course of the day and the next, Danny heard that A, Mr. Stinger tried to kill everybody in his family, including Robin, with his World War II souvenir pistol. B, Mr. Stinger ripped the house to pieces while he was stinko. C, Mr. Stinger had been discovered eating a bowl of dead bugs and grass, like they were cereal and milk, and crying while he did it. D, Mr. Stinger had tried to strangle his wife with a stocking when the Red Sox lost a big ball game. Finally, too troubled to keep it to himself, he had asked Daddy about Mr. Stinger. His daddy had taken him on his lap and explained that Mr. Stinger
had been under a great deal of strain. Some of it about his family, and some about his job, some of it about things that nobody but doctors could understand. He had been having crying fits. 3 nights ago, he had gotten crying and couldn't stop it. Had broken a lot of things in the Stinger home. It wasn't losing your marbles, Daddy said. It was having a breakdown. And Mr. Stinger wasn't in a bug house, but in a sanitarium. But despite Daddy's careful explanations, Danny was scared. There didn't seem to be any difference at all between losing your marbles and having a breakdown. And whether you called it a bug house or a sanitarium, there were still bars on the windows, and they wouldn't let you out if you wanted to go. And his father, quite innocently, had confirmed another of Scotty's phrases unchanged, one that filled Danny with a vague and unformed dread. In the place where Mr. Stinger now lived, there were the men in the white coats. They came to get you in a truck with no windows. A truck that was gravestone gray. It rolled up to the curb in front of your house, and the men in the white coats got out and took you away from your family and made you live in a room with soft walls. And if you wanted to write home, you had to do it with Crayolas.
When will they let him come back? Danny asked his father.
Just as soon as he's better, Doc.
But when will that be?
Danny had persisted. Dan, Jack said, no one knows. And that was the worst of it all. It was another way of saying, never, never, never. A month later, Robin's mother took him out of the nursery school, and they moved away from Stovington without Mr. Stinger. That had been over a year ago, after Daddy stopped taking the bad stuff, but before he had lost his job. Danny still thought about it often. Sometimes when he fell down or bumped his head or had a bellyache, he'd begin to cry, and the memory would flash over him, accompanied by the fear that he would not be able to stop crying. They'd just go on, weeping and wailing, till his daddy went to the phone, dialed it, and said, "Hello, this is Jack Torrance at 149 Maple Line Way. My son here can't stop crying. Please send the men in the white coats to take him to the sanitarium. That's right, he's lost his marbles. Thank you." And the gray truck with no windows would come rolling up to his door, and they'd load him in, still weeping hysterically, and take him away. When would he see his mommy and daddy again? No one knows. It was this fear that had kept him silent. A year older, he was quite sure that his daddy and mommy wouldn't let him be taken away for thinking a fire hose was a snake. His rational mind was sure of that. But still, when he thought of telling them, that old memory rose up like a stone, filling his mouth and blocking words. It was like Tony. Tony had always seemed perfectly natural, until the bad dreams, of course. And his parents had also seemed to accept Tony as a more or less natural phenomenon. Things like Tony came from being bright, which they both assumed he was, the same way they assumed they were bright. But a fire hose that turned into a snake,
seeing blood and brains on the wall of the presidential suite when no one else could. Those things would not be natural. They had already taken him to see a regular doctor. Was it not reasonable to assume that the men in the white coats might come next? Still, he might have told them, except he was sure sooner or later that they would want to take him away from the hotel. And he wanted desperately to get away from the Overlook. But he also knew this was Daddy's last chance. That he was here at the Overlook to do more than take care of the place. He was here to work on his papers, to get over losing his job, to love Mommy/Wendy. And until very recently, it had seemed that all those things were happening. It was only lately that Daddy had begun to have trouble, since he found those papers. This inhuman place makes inhuman monsters. This inhuman place makes human monsters. What did that mean? He had prayed to God, but God hadn't told him. And what would Daddy do if he stopped working here? He had tried to find out from Daddy's mind, and become more and more convinced that Daddy didn't know. Strongest proof had come earlier this evening when Uncle Al had called his daddy up on the phone and said mean things. Daddy didn't dare say anything back, because Uncle Al would fire him from his job just the way that Mr. Cromert, the Stovington headmaster, and the board of directors had fired him from his school teaching job. And Daddy was scared to death of that, for him and Mommy as well as himself. So he didn't dare say anything. He could only watch helplessly and hope that there really weren't any Indians at all. Or if there were, they would be content to wait for bigger game and let their little 3-wagon train pass unmolested. But he couldn't believe it, no matter how hard he tried. Things were worse at the Overlook now. The snow was coming, and when it did, any poor options he had would be abrogated. And after the snow, what? What then? When they were shut in and at the mercy of whatever might have been only toying with them before. Come out here and take your medicine. What then? Red rum. He shivered in his bed and turned over again. He could read more now. Tomorrow, maybe he could try to call Tony. He'd try to make Tony show him exactly what red rum was. And if there was any way he could prevent it, he would risk the nightmares. He had to know. Danny was still awake long after his parents' false sleep had become the real thing. He rolled in his bed, twisting the sheets, grappling with a problem years too big for him. Awake in the night like a single sentinel in picket. And sometime after midnight, he slept too. And then only the wind was awake, prying at the hotel and hooting its gables under the bright gimlet gaze of the stars.